Hey everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. Today I want to argue that Family Guy did not just get worse over time. It systematically dismantled the one character who made the show worth watching in the first place. Peter Griffin, the loud, clumsy, warm-hearted father who pulled 22 million viewers on his very first night on television, was replaced season by season with something so far from the original that the show's own fan communities eventually listed him on the Villains Wiki. That replacement did not happen because of one bad decision or one bad season. It happened through a long chain of small choices, a single IQ test in season 4, a writing room that changed during a 3-year cancellation, a creator whose attention was pulled in too many directions, and a series of episodes that pushed the character further into cruelty, while the warmth that had justified all his chaos quietly disappeared. We are going to go through it all, season by season, episode by episode, and by the end of this video, the full picture of how one of television's most beloved characters got slowly taken apart will be impossible to ignore. But before we get into it, I would just like to ask you to subscribe if you have not already. It is completely free and it genuinely helps us keep making videos like this one for this community. Alright, let us get into it. The Peter Griffin nobody talks about anymore, seasons 1 to 3. Most people who watch Family Guy today think they know Peter Griffin. They picture a loud, overweight man who screams at his daughter, shoots his friends, and does things so wrong that even the other characters look at him like he's broken. That version of Peter is the one that's been on television for the past 15 plus years. That version has tens of thousands of memes built around him. That version is what people mean when they say they either love or hate Family Guy. But that is not the Peter Griffin who built this show. There was a different Peter Griffin, one that most younger fans have never actually seen in the way the show originally intended. One that existed for the first 3 seasons, before the cancellation, before the revival, before the writing room changed and the character got slowly dismantled piece by piece until almost nothing was left of the original. And if you want to understand why Family Guy ruined Peter Griffin, you have to start here, with the version of the character that made the show worth caring about in the first place. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. 22 million people watched that first episode, Death Has a Shadow. That number alone tells you something. You do not get 22 million viewers by accident. People tuned in because something about this family felt watchable. Not likable in a perfect way, not clean or safe, but real in a specific, messy way that most television families were not. The Griffins were loud and chaotic and clearly not handling everything well. But at the center of all of it was a father who, underneath all the stupidity, you could tell actually loved these people. That is the thing about early Peter that gets forgotten. He was not smart. He was not responsible. He was not the kind of father anyone would hold up as an example of good parenting. He made mistakes constantly. He chased dumb ideas. He embarrassed his family in public. He sometimes said the wrong things so badly that Lois would have to step in and fix the damage. None of that is in dispute. But the key difference, the thing that made all of that funny instead of just depressing, was that you could feel that he cared. When Peter did something stupid, there was almost always a moment where he understood what he had done wrong. The show would circle back to the family, to the relationship, to something that reminded you this man was genuinely trying even when he was failing. The structure of early Family Guy episodes was simple, and it worked. Peter would get some idea or stumble into a situation. Things would go wrong because of who he was. Lois would get frustrated or angry. Peter would eventually realize the mess he had made. Then, by the end of the episode, they would find their way back to each other. Not in a fake television way where everything was perfectly resolved with a bow on top, but in a real enough way where you believed these two people actually wanted to be together. Lois and Peter would say they loved each other, and you believed it because the episode had earned it. That rhythm, Peter screws up, Peter learns something, the family stays together, was the backbone of the entire show in those early seasons. And it was not just his relationship with Lois. Early Peter had genuine moments with all 3 of his kids. Chris, Meg, and Stewie were each handled differently, but the common thread was that Peter noticed them. He was present in a way that his later version simply is not. There are documented moments from these first 3 seasons where Peter stands up for Meg when outsiders come after her. There is a moment that longtime fans reference where Peter says he would take a bullet for her. That line exists. It was in the show. And if you only started watching Family Guy in the later seasons, you would never believe it, because the Peter you know would not say that and mean it. Meg, in those early seasons, was also written completely differently. She was portrayed as a typical teenage girl, wanting to be popular, embarrassed by her parents, crushing on boys, trying to figure out who she was. She was not a punching bag. The family's weirdness embarrassed her, which is a normal thing for a teenager to feel, but she was not targeted. She was not the subject of cruelty from her own father. She was just a girl growing up in a house full of chaos. The fact that her character later became became the show's main target for abuse says a lot about where the writers took things, but that change had not happened yet. In seasons 1 through 3, Meg was just Meg. Peter's relationship with Brian in those early seasons is also something worth noting. Brian was the smart one, or at least the one who read books, drank martinis, and called out Peter's bad ideas. The dynamic between the two of them worked because they genuinely liked each other. Brian would shake his head at Peter's choices and then help him anyway, because that is what friends do. Peter and Brian being best friends made the show feel grounded. There was a person in Peter's life who would tell him when he was wrong, and Peter would listen. Not always right away, not always gracefully, but eventually. That relationship gave the show an emotional anchor. Without it, and without the lesson at the end structure, there was nothing to stop Peter from becoming completely unaccountable for anything he ever did. It is also worth being honest about the fact that even in these early seasons, Peter was not perfect. He was selfish sometimes. He chased things without thinking about how they would affect his family. He had a big mouth and said things he should not have. There are episodes from seasons 1 through 3 where Peter behaves in ways that are hard to defend. None of this is being hidden. The early version of Peter was not a saint. He was not supposed to be. He was supposed to be a real, flawed, working-class man, trying to hold things together with a personality that constantly got in his own way. But here's the difference between a flawed character and a broken one. A flawed character does bad things and the show acknowledges it. The world around him reacts. He faces some kind of consequence. Not always legal, not always dramatic, but something real. He grows slightly, or at the very least, he recognizes that he did something wrong. The humor comes from the tension between who he wants to be and what he actually does. That tension is what makes a character interesting over the long term. Peter Griffin in seasons 1 through 3 had that tension. He wanted to be a good father. He wanted to be a good husband. He genuinely cared about the people in his life, even when he was making their lives harder. The comedy worked because you were laughing at someone you also respected, at least a little. You were not laughing at someone you had written off entirely. Family Guy finished its first season ranked 33rd in the Nielsen ratings. That is a solid number for a brand new adult animated show, but it was not a monster hit. Fox shuffled the show around between time slots, and viewership dropped. By season 3, the show was being moved to Thursday nights at 8 p.m., where it went head-to-head with Friends, which was, at that point, one of the most watched shows in the history of American television. The ratings collapsed. Fox canceled Family Guy in 2002 after the third season. Here is the thing about that cancellation, though. The show came back 3 years later because people missed it enough to buy the DVDs in enormous numbers and watch the reruns on Adult Swim until the cable channel's ratings went through the roof. They were not missing a show that featured a cruel, unpredictable man screaming at his daughter. They were missing a show about a flawed but lovable family bumbling through life together. They were missing Peter Griffin, the original one. When the show was brought back in 2005, the stated goal from Seth McFarland and the writers was to pick up exactly where things had left off, to keep the show exactly as it was. They said that publicly. But the writing staff had almost completely changed during the 3-year gap. Key writers from the original run had moved on to other shows. New people came in. And as the seasons went on, the character of Peter went in a direction that had nothing to do with the man audiences had voted for with their DVD purchases. That original Peter, the one from 1999 to 2002, was the foundation everything else was supposed to be built on. He was the reason the show had an audience at all. And understanding what he was, clearly and specifically, is the only way to understand just how far the show traveled in the wrong direction. __quote _1 ___. Because what came next was not a natural evolution of a character growing and changing with his show. It was something else entirely. It was a slow, season-by-season replacement of everything that made Peter Griffin worth watching. And it started with a single episode in season 4 that handed the writers a permanent excuse for every terrible thing they would do to this character going forward. Section 2. The Cancellation, the Comeback, and the Writing Room That Changed Everything. Season 4. When Family Guy was canceled in 2002, it did not go quietly. Fox pulled the plug after 3 seasons. The reasons were straightforward on the surface. Bad time slots, brutal competition, falling ratings. In its third season, the show had been moved to Thursday nights at 8 p.m., which placed it directly against Friends. At the time, Friends was one of the most watched programs in American television history. It had millions of loyal viewers who were not going anywhere. Family Guy did not stand a chance in that slot, and the numbers reflected it. The ratings dropped badly enough that Fox made the call to end the show. Just like that, the Griffin family was gone. But something unusual happened in the years that followed. People missed the show. Not in the quiet, fading way that canceled television usually gets missed, where fans groan about it for a few weeks and then move on, but in a loud, active way that the television industry had genuinely never seen before. Viewers who had watched Family Guy during its original run wanted more of it. And when Fox began selling the reruns to other networks looking to make back some money from a show that had already been canceled, they found a buyer in Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block. What happened next was something nobody in the industry had predicted. When Adult Swim began airing Family Guy reruns in 2003, the show became the most watched program on the entire network. It was not close. The Adult Swim block saw its viewership increase by 239% because of Family Guy reruns. People were not just watching, they were watching over and over, tuning in at late hours on a cable channel to see episodes they had already seen, because there was something about this show and this family that kept pulling them back. At the exact same time, Fox released the Season 1 and Season 2 DVDs. This was a relatively new idea in 2003. The market for television DVDs was still being figured out. But Family Guy's DVD releases did not just sell well. They became the best-selling television DVDs of the entire year. Over 2 million copies were sold. That number made Family Guy the second highest-selling television DVD set of all time at that point, behind only the first season of Chappelle's Show. To put that in plain terms, a show that had been canceled for low ratings was now outselling almost every other television DVD ever made. Fox noticed. Of course they noticed. In May 2004, Fox announced they were ordering 35 new episodes of Family Guy. It was officially the first time in television history that a show had been brought back from cancellation based entirely on DVD sales and cable reruns. There was no petition that did it, no major campaign, no star calling in favors. The audience had simply bought enough copies and watched enough reruns to make the math impossible to ignore. The Griffins were coming back. Seth McFarland, speaking about the revival years later, described the moment Fox called him as shocking. He had genuinely believed the show was finished. He had tried working on other projects during the 3-year gap, and by his own account, none of them felt right because Family Guy felt unfinished. When Fox brought him back in, he was excited in a way that was clear in his public statements at the time. This was his show, his characters, and he was getting another chance to do something with them. The first episode of the revived series, North by North Quahog, premiered on May 1st, 2005. McFarland wrote it himself and directed Peter Shin. It opened with Peter telling the family that they had been canceled, directly referencing everything Fox had cleared off its schedule to make room for other shows, rattling off a long list of programs that had all been canceled, leaning into the self-aware humor the show was known for. It was a confident return. The episode earned strong ratings. The audience was there. Family Guy was back. McFarland said publicly that the writing staff's goal coming back was to keep the show exactly as it had been. No slicker animation, no different tone, no big reinvention. The same Family Guy that people had bought on DVD and watched obsessively on Adult Swim in the middle of the night. That was the stated plan. But here is the part that never gets talked about enough when people discuss the revival. The writers who had built the show in its original form were mostly gone. During the 3 years that Family Guy was off the air, the people who had written those early seasons moved on to other jobs. Ricky Blitt, who had been part of the original writing staff, had not written an episode since season 2 and went on to create his own show. Neil Goldman and Garrett Donovan, who were part of the team that shaped the original run, left during the hiatus and went to work on Scrubs. Gary Janetti, another key early writer, left and went to Will and Grace. Matt Weitzman and Mike Barker, both important figures in the original writing room, also departed and moved over to American Dad. Gene Laufenberg, one of the early writers, was gone by the very start of season 4. These were not minor contributors. These were people who had helped build Peter Griffin, Lois Griffin, and the entire emotional structure of the show. When they left, they took something with them. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way anyone necessarily announced or noticed right away, but in the slow, quiet way that happens when the people who understood what made something work are no longer in the room. Their replacements were talented writers, many of whom would go on to have long careers on the show, but they had not built these characters from scratch. They inherited them. And when you inherit a character you did not create, you work from the outside in, from what the character does, what the character says, what gets laughs, rather than from the inside out, from who the character is and why he does what he does. That shift in perspective from a writing room full of people who had built Peter to a writing room full of people who had received Peter is one of the most important and least discussed reasons for what happened to him. On top of that, Seth MacFarlane's time and attention were increasingly being pulled in multiple directions. American Dad had launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy came back. The Cleveland Show would follow in 2009. MacFarlane was not just the voice of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. He was running multiple shows simultaneously, while also pursuing a career as a performer and musician. His direct involvement in the day-to-day writing of Family Guy became less focused as the years went on. The show was no longer the single project he was pouring everything into the way he had during its original run. MacFarlane himself has acknowledged, in interviews over the years, that as the series went on, he and the writers agreed that the original Peter's personality had started to feel dated, so they began writing him differently. That is a direct admission from the creator of the show. The decision to change Peter Griffin was made deliberately. It was not purely the result of writers misunderstanding the character or drifting away from him accidentally. At some point, people in charge of the show looked at the original Peter and decided he needed to be something else. What is worth asking is, different in what direction? Because the Peter Griffin that emerged after the revival did not become more complex. He did not become deeper or more layered. The changes that came over the following seasons did not make him a richer character who surprised you with new dimensions as the show went on. What happened was simpler and more damaging than that. Peter became louder. He became more extreme. His stupidity, which had always been part of who he was, got turned up season by season until it went from a character trait to the only thing that defined him. His warmth, which had always been the thing that made the stupidity forgivable and even lovable, got turned down the same way, gradually, quietly, until it was barely there at all. The audience did not notice at first because it happened slowly. Season 4 still had plenty of good episodes. There were moments where the original Peter showed up, and the show felt like what it used to be. The comedy was still sharp in places, the cast was still excellent. Seth MacFarlane's voice performances, across Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire, remained some of the most distinctive in animation. There was enough of the old show present that you could watch Season 4 and feel like you were mostly watching the same Family Guy. But something was shifting underneath all of it. The lesson at the end structure that had grounded the original show was starting to disappear. Episodes were beginning to end with Peter getting away with things he should not have gotten away with. The emotional beat, Peter realizes his mistake, the family comes back together, started showing up less often. Cutaway gags, which had always been a feature of the show but had worked around the plot, were starting to take over in a way that left less room for anything else. And in Season 4, there was a single episode that crystallized all of this. One that seemed like a funny, standalone joke about Peter being even dumber than everyone already knew, but that quietly handed the writing staff a tool they would use to justify everything that came after it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That episode gave Peter an official IQ score. It made his mental limitations not just a personality quirk, but a legal fact. And from that moment on, the show had a permanent excuse to make Peter do anything, no matter how cruel, how destructive, how completely removed from the man he used to be, without ever having to answer for it. Section 3. Making it official. Season 4's Quote 4 and the IQ that broke everything. There is a moment in every long-running television show where you can point to a specific episode and say, this is where things changed. Not always in an obvious way. not always in a way that viewers noticed while it was happening. Sometimes the most damaging shifts in a character's history are disguised as comedy. They are wrapped in a funny premise, delivered with a great performance, and reviewed positively by the people whose job it is to evaluate these things. They get laughs, they get quoted, they get remembered fondly. And underneath all of that, while no one is paying close enough attention, they quietly destroy something that took years to build. For Peter Griffin, that episode is Petarded. Petarded is the 6th episode of Season 4 of Family Guy. It first aired on June 19th, 2005, just a few weeks into the show's revival. It was written by Alex Sulkin and Wellesley Wild and directed by Seth Kearsley. The title is a combination of __quote _7__, and a word for someone who is mentally disabled. The show was not subtle about what it was going for. The episode's central idea came from Seth McFarland himself, according to the DVD commentary, even though Sulkin and Wild did the actual writing. The setup is straightforward. The Griffins have their neighbors over for game night. Lois, knowing how easily Peter's feelings get hurt when he loses, secretly gives Peter the preschool edition cards during a game of Trivial Pursuit, so he can get the easy questions and feel like he's winning. Peter wins. Peter then does exactly what you would expect Peter to do. He becomes completely insufferable about it. He starts talking down to everyone around him, convinced he is a genius. He brags. He lectures. He is thoroughly unbearable in the specific way that only a person with zero self-awareness can be when they think they have proven something about themselves. Brian, who has watched all of this with barely contained frustration, decides enough is enough. He challenges Peter to prove his intelligence by actually applying for the MacArthur Fellows Program, a real grant given to genuinely brilliant people. Peter agrees without hesitation, because in his mind, the Trivial Pursuit victory has confirmed what he has always suspected about himself. The test results come back. Peter does not just score low. He scores so low that the results determine he is legally mentally disabled, with an IQ of 70. In terms of pure comedy, the episode handles this well. The scene where Peter processes the results, the moment he realizes he can use his disability as a way to get away with things, the escalating chaos that follows, all of it is written and performed with real skill. There is a musical number. There is a scene where Peter announces over a restaurant's public address system the word, quote, 8, followed by, quote, 9. There is the moment where he accidentally covers Lois in burning hot oil from a stolen deep fryer, which lands her in the hospital. There is a courtroom scene where Peter complains he is being unfairly treated, and the judge tells him directly that he is a monster. The episode earned strong reviews. IGN ranked it the best Family Guy episode ever in 2014, calling it the show at its comedic best. But here is what the reviews did not spend enough time on. By making Peter's mental disability an official, documented legal fact, by putting an IQ score on it, by having a judge and a state agency formally recognize it, the show permanently changed the rules around his character. Before Petarded, Peter's stupidity was just part of who he was. It was a character trait like any other. It made him funny, it got him into trouble, it was the source of many of the show's best moments. But it was a trait that existed alongside other traits. It existed alongside his love for his family, his loyalty to his friends, his occasional moments of surprising clarity, his ability, however imperfect, to recognize when he had done something wrong. After Petarded, his stupidity was not just a trait anymore. It was a diagnosis. It was a legal excuse. It was a card the show could play any time it needed to explain away something Peter did that had no other justification. And the writers used it. Season after season, the card got played. Not always in an obvious way. Not always with someone in the episode looking at the camera and saying, well, he's mentally disabled, so... But the logic was baked into the show from that point forward. Peter could do increasingly terrible things, and the structure of the series would not demand that he answer for them, because there was always the understanding, built into his official character history by this single episode, that Peter was not fully responsible for his actions. He had a documented condition. The show had put it on paper. TV Tropes, which has tracked this in detail, documents that Peter's Flanderization began directly after, quote, 13, quote. The exact language used is that his intelligence, quote, 14, quote, and that his original Flanderization started with this episode. It also notes that before this point, Peter's harmful behavior was mostly a case of being oblivious, too arrogant and too dumb to fully understand what he was doing wrong. After this point, that changed. Slowly at first, but consistently, Peter moved towards something darker. The obliviousness became apathy. The apathy eventually became something that looked more like cruelty. It is worth being specific about what that shift actually looked like in practice, because this is not an abstract idea. The difference between an oblivious character and a cruel one is enormous, and it completely changes how an audience relates to what they are watching. An oblivious character is funny because the gap between what they intend and what they actually cause is wide and obvious to everyone except them. You laugh at the gap. You feel a little sorry for them. You root for them to eventually see what everyone else sees. There is warmth in that comedy because the character is not trying to hurt anyone. They just keep accidentally doing it anyway. A cruel character is different. When a character is aware of the harm they cause, or when the show stops caring whether they are aware of it or not, the comedy changes completely. It becomes colder. There is nothing to root for anymore, because there is no version of this character that is trying to do the right thing and failing. They are just doing wrong things, and the show treats that as funny on its own terms. That is a very different kind of humor, and it requires a very different kind of character. It is not the kind of humor that Family Guy was built on in seasons 1 through 3. Petarded did not flip that switch overnight. The episode itself is still in the territory of oblivious rather than cruel. Peter is not deliberately trying to hurt Lois when he pours hot oil on her. He is just being catastrophically irresponsible with a deep fryer he stole from a fast food restaurant. The harm is real, but the intent is absent. That is still within the original Peter's range. The damage the episode did was not in what Peter did in those 22 minutes. The damage was in what it set up for every episode that came after. Because once you establish in writing that a character is officially, legally, documentably not fully responsible for their actions, you have removed the most important thing that makes a character worth watching over the long term. You have removed accountability. And a character without accountability can do anything, literally anything, and the show never has to ask you to seriously reckon with it. The __quote _16 _ logic is always quietly there, absorbing the consequences that should have landed. The other thing quote 17 did that gets overlooked is how it changed the show's relationship with Peter as a parent specifically. In the episode, Child Protective Services takes the Griffin children away from Peter because he is deemed mentally unfit to be a parent. The kids end up staying with Cleveland while Lois recovers in the hospital. The state, through an official judge and official agency, formally determines that Peter Griffin is not equipped to raise children. That is not a throwaway joke. That is the show putting on record, officially and within its own story, that this man should not be trusted with his family. Now, by the end of the episode, Lois recovers and gets the kids back, and everything returns to normal. That is how episodic television works. Reset button hit, status quo restored. But the thing about a reset button is that it erases the consequences without erasing what caused them. Peter did not change. Peter did not grow. Peter was not made safer or more responsible. The situation resolved because Lois recovered, not because Peter became someone who deserved to have his family back. The show moved on, and so did the audience, and the IQ score and the court's judgment stayed on the books as part of who Peter Griffin officially was. That is the lasting damage of __quote _18 __, not the episode itself, which is genuinely funny in a lot of places and stands up reasonably well even now. The damage is in what it handed to the writing staff going forward, a ready-made explanation built into the official character record for why Peter could do terrible things without ever truly having to face what he had done. Season 4 had only just begun when this aired. There were entire seasons ahead, and with each one that passed, the writers would reach a little further, push Peter a little harder, put him in situations that were a little more cruel and a little less forgivable. The IQ of 70 is a number that gets quoted in Family Guy discussions fairly often, usually as a punchline or a piece of trivia, but it is more than that. It is the moment the show officially told itself it did not need to hold Peter to any standard. It is the number on the document that gave the writing room permission to do whatever they wanted with this character. And in the seasons that followed, they took full advantage of that permission. __quote _19 __. The most immediate target of what came next was not a stranger, not a neighbor, not some outside character brought in for an episode. It was someone who had been in the show since the very beginning, someone who had already been quietly edged toward the margins, someone who, in the original version of the show, Peter had once said he would take a bullet for. Section 4. The Meg Problem. Seasons 4 to 5. How a bumbling dad became a targeted abuser. Before anything else, let's be honest about something. Family Guy was never a show about perfect people being kind to each other. That was never the point. From the very first episode, the Griffins were a messy, loud, chaotic household, where people said things they probably should not have said, and did things they probably should not have done. Peter was selfish. Lois had a sharp tongue. Chris was clueless. Stewie spent the early seasons openly plotting to kill his own mother. None of this was hidden. The show was an adult cartoon, and it wore that identity openly. Uncomfortable humor was part of the deal from day one. So when people talk about what happened to Meg Griffin, it is important to be clear that the conversation is not about the show suddenly introducing darkness that was never there before. The darkness was always there. The question is about direction. The question is about what that darkness was aimed at, and why, and what it revealed about the character of Peter Griffin as the seasons went on. Because there is a meaningful difference between a show being uncomfortable and a show being cruel. And the story of how Family Guy treated Meg Griffin across seasons 4 and 5 is the clearest, most documented example of Peter Griffin's character being taken somewhere the original show never intended him to go. In seasons 1 through 3, Meg Griffin was a teenage girl. That sounds simple, but it is worth holding on to. She was not a punching bag. She was not a target. She was a regular teenage character navigating the specific embarrassment of having a family like the Griffins. Her storylines in those early seasons were built around things that actual teenagers deal with: wanting to be popular, having crushes, feeling like her parents did not understand her, wishing her family would act normal for 5 consecutive minutes. The humor around Meg in those seasons came from how relatable that experience was, not from watching her get torn apart. Peter, in those early seasons, was not her enemy. He was her embarrassing father. There is a significant difference between those two things. An embarrassing father does dumb things that make his daughter cringe in public. He shows up at the wrong moment. He says something awkward to her friends. He is loud and oblivious and difficult to be seen with. That is Peter in seasons 1 through 3 with Meg. He was not targeting her. He was just being himself, which happened to be mortifying for a teenage girl trying to navigate high school. That dynamic made sense. It was grounded in something real. And crucially, there are moments in those early seasons, documented and confirmed by people who have tracked the show carefully, where Peter defended Meg, where he showed up for her, where you could feel that underneath all the chaos, he genuinely loved his daughter. There is a moment referenced by longtime fans and character analysts where Peter states he would take a bullet for Meg. That line exists in the early seasons. It is part of the original record of who this character was. A man who would take a bullet for his daughter. Hold that thought, because what comes next makes it impossible to square with where the show took things. The shift begins in season 4. The specific episode most often cited as the starting point is __quote _20 __. In this episode, Lois begins a modeling career. When Peter sees Lois's modeling pictures, he tells the family he is going to do something inappropriate with them. Both Chris and Meg, hearing this, respond the same way. They both say, "Me too." Peter's reaction is to turn immediately to Meg and scream at her, treating her response as disgusting and wrong, while completely ignoring that Chris said the exact same thing first. He then kicks Meg out of the house. Read that again, because the details matter here. Both children said the same thing. Peter screamed at only one of them. He punished only one of them. And later in the same episode, when Meg tries to speak up about something unrelated, Peter responds with, quote, "That is not an embarrassing father. That is a father who has decided, for reasons the show does not explain or justify, that one of his children deserves to be treated differently from the others." The humor is not coming from Peter being oblivious to consequences anymore. The humor is coming from Peter actively singling out Meg and dismissing her. That is a different kind of joke, built on a different kind of character. And it marks a real line between what Peter was before and what he was becoming. Season 5 pushed further. In quote 23, the family is in danger. In the middle of the crisis, Peter casually reminds Lois of something they apparently agreed on before, that if they could only save 2 of the children, they would leave Meg. He says this without hesitation. He says it like it is a reasonable thing that 2 parents would have actually discussed and settled. The show plays it as a quick joke and moves on. But what it reveals about Peter in this moment is significant. This is not a man being stupid. Stupidity does not explain a parent deciding in advance that one of their children is worth less than the others. That requires something colder than stupidity. In __quote _24 __, also in the later seasons, there is a cutaway gag where Meg simply comes home and says, quote, 25 Peter shoots her. Not metaphorically, he literally shoots Meg with a gun as a response to his daughter greeting him when she walks in the door. It is presented as a punchline. The show moves on immediately. TV Tropes documents all of this in detail, confirming that the abuse of Meg began in Season 4 and continued growing through Season 5 and beyond. The characterization is precise. In Seasons 4 and 5, the abuse could still be described as the show joking around, even if Meg did not find it funny. But the direction was established. The writers had found something that got a reaction, and they kept pulling at it. Here is why this matters, specifically for understanding what happened to Peter Griffin as a character, not just as a father. The original Peter was someone who bumbled and failed and caused problems without meaning to. That character worked because there was always the understanding that he did not want to hurt the people around him. The harm he caused was accidental, a byproduct of being who he was. The moment the show shifted to Peter deliberately targeting Meg, choosing her specifically, singling her out over Chris, treating her differently on purpose, it crossed a line that changes everything about the character. An oblivious father who embarrasses his daughter is a comedy character. A father who has quietly decided that one of his children does not deserve the same treatment as the others is something harder to laugh at. And the show, by leaning into that second version of Peter without ever examining it or addressing it seriously, started building a character who is less and less likable, not because he was flawed, but because the flaws were no longer connected to anything sympathetic. It is also worth noting what this did to the rest of the family. When a show establishes that one character is acceptable to target, it creates a permission structure. Once the writing staff understood that Meg being treated badly got a reaction, the instinct was to go further. And going further meant not just Peter participating, but the whole household shifting to accommodate this dynamic. By the time Season 5 was finished, Meg was no longer just an embarrassed teenager. She had become the designated lowest member of the Griffin family, and that ranking was actively maintained by her own father. In quote _26, also from the later seasons, Peter treats Meg horribly after she gets the mumps. He is not accidentally careless. He is deliberate and mean-spirited. And at the end of the episode, he faces no real consequence for it. He does not grow. He does not realize anything. The show simply moves on to the next story. This is the pattern that TV Tropes identifies when it documents Peter's progression during this period. Before Season 4, when Peter caused harm, the show would generally circle back and acknowledge it in some way. Not always perfectly, not always in a deeply serious manner, but enough to signal that the show understood the difference between what was funny and what was wrong. That signal started disappearing in Seasons 4 and 5. Episodes began ending without Peter accounting for the specific harm he had caused to specific people. The reset button was being hit faster, with less earned emotional ground before it was pressed. The writing staff change discussed in the previous section is directly relevant here. The writers who had built Meg as a character, who understood her not just as Peter's daughter, but as a person with her own story and her own value within the show's world, were largely gone by the revival. The new writers inherited a character they had not created, and found that making her the subject of jokes was easier than writing her as a full person. The path of least resistance in television writing often wins. And the path of least resistance with Meg Griffin was to make her the family's punching bag. But the punching bag does not exist in isolation. For Meg to be a target, someone has to be doing the targeting. And that someone, more than anyone else in the Griffin household, was Peter. Every episode where Peter shot at Meg, dismissed Meg, excluded Meg, or reminded the audience that Meg was less valuable than everyone else in his family, was also an episode that told you something about who Peter was. And what it told you was not good. The man who once said he would take a bullet for his daughter had become the person his daughter most needed to be protected from. That reversal did not happen all at once. It happened in small moments across seasons 4 and 5. A scream here, a joke there, a casual comment about leaving her behind in a dangerous situation. Each individual moment could be excused as just a gag. Taken together, they painted a picture of a character who had fundamentally changed. And what made it worse, what made it genuinely damaging rather than just unpleasant, was the show's refusal to acknowledge the change. The original Peter had been set up as someone who cared about his family. That version of the character was still being referenced, still being leaned on whenever the show needed you to feel something warm about the Griffins. But the actual behavior on screen was moving further and further away from that original version with every season that passed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That gap between the character the show claimed Peter was and the character Peter actually was on screen would become the central problem of Family Guy for years to come. And it would only get wider as the series moved into its next phase, one where the show stops just edging Peter toward cruelty and began making it his defining characteristic, season by season, with something that every longtime viewer eventually had to acknowledge. It had a name. And once you know what that name means, you start seeing it everywhere. Section 5. The Flanderization clock hits. Season 6. When Funny Idiot became Functioning Sociopath. There is a word that gets used a lot in conversations about animated shows and long-running television characters. It is a word that started as a piece of internet vocabulary, got picked up by TV critics and fan communities, and eventually became the most precise way to describe what happens when a character gets slowly destroyed by their own writers over time. The word is Flanderization. It comes from Ned Flanders, the neighbor character in The Simpsons. In the early seasons of that show, Ned was a well-rounded person who happened to be deeply religious. His faith was part of him, but it was one part among many. He had a full life, real relationships, things he cared about beyond just being the Christian neighbor next door. Over many seasons of The Simpsons, that changed. The character was slowly reduced until the only thing left was his religious beliefs. Every other part of him faded away. He became a walking version of one single trait. That process, taking a character with multiple dimensions and grinding them down until only one dimension is left, became known as Flanderization, named after the character it happened to most visibly. And in Season 6 of Family Guy, it happened to Peter Griffin. Not completely, not all at once. Season 6 is not the moment Peter becomes the fully broken character he would eventually turn into. But Season 6 is the season that most critics, fans, and character analysts point to as the point of acceleration. The season where the changes that had been building quietly in Seasons 4 and 5 stopped being subtle and started being obvious. The Loathsome Characters Wiki, which tracks character deterioration in detail, specifically identifies mid-Season 6 as the point where even casual viewers began to register that something had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer just the show being edgy or dark in its usual way. This was a character being replaced. To understand what Flanderization did to Peter, you need to understand what he had been before it took hold. In Seasons 1 through 3, Peter had multiple traits that worked together. He was stupid, yes. He was impulsive, yes. He was loud and often thoughtless and regularly made things worse for everyone around him. But he was also warm. He was also loyal. He was also, at his core, a man who wanted to do right by his family, even when everything he did got in the way of that. He was funny because those traits existed in tension with each other. The warmth and the chaos, the good intentions and the terrible execution. That tension was the engine of the comedy. Flanderization dismantles that engine. It takes one trait, in Peter's case, his stupidity and his selfishness, and turns it up while turning everything else down. Season by season, the warmth got quieter. The loyalty became less reliable. The moments where Peter recognized he had done something wrong and tried to fix it became rarer. And the stupidity and the selfishness became louder, more extreme, and less connected to anything else about the character. By season 6, the man who remained was a version of Peter that had most of his original parts missing. One of the clearest signs of this was what happened to the show's episode structure. In seasons 1 through 3, most episodes followed the same basic shape. Something would happen, Peter would respond to it in a way that made everything worse, the family would deal with the fallout, and by the end of the episode, there would be some kind of resolution. The resolution did not have to be perfect or deeply emotional. It just had to exist. It just had to signal that the show cared about the people it was built around. That structure started breaking down in season 6. Episodes increasingly ended without Peter accounting for the harm he had caused. The final beat of the episode, the moment of recognition, the repair, the small piece of growth, started disappearing. In its place, the show increasingly leaned on cutaway gags as the primary way to fill time and generate laughs. Cutaway gags had always been a feature of Family Guy. They were part of what made the show distinctive. But in the original run, they worked around the plot. The story came first, and the cutaways supported it. In season 6, that relationship started reversing. The cutaways began to feel like the main event, and the story became the thin thread connecting them together. This matters for understanding Peter's character specifically because the cutaway gag format does not require a character to be consistent. A cutaway exists outside the normal flow of the episode. It is a separate moment, usually delivered by Peter as a reference to something else, and then it ends and the show moves on. When the show was built around a real plot with real emotional stakes, Peter had to be someone who could carry those stakes. He had to be a person the audience would follow through a story that meant something. When the show shifted toward being primarily a collection of cutaway gags held together by a loose premise, Peter stopped needing to be that person. He just needed to be a delivery mechanism for jokes. That is a significant downgrade for a main character, and it shows. The relationship between Peter and Brian also changed during this period in a way that removed one of the show's most important stabilizing forces. In the original run, Peter and Brian were best friends. Brian was the one who called Peter out, who told him when he was wrong, who stayed with him anyway because that is what real friendship looks like. That dynamic gave the show an emotional anchor. There was always someone in Peter's immediate circle who would push back, who would not simply go along with whatever Peter decided to do. Brian's presence meant that Peter's worst impulses had to at least encounter some resistance before they could run loose. As season 6 moved forward, that shifted. Brian and Stewie had become such a popular pairing. Their road trip episodes were among the most well-received things the show had produced in its revival era, that the writing naturally started sending them off together more often, which meant that Peter and Brian were together less often, which meant that the character most responsible for providing Peter with a check on his behavior was increasingly somewhere else. The voice of reason had been pulled out of the room where it was most needed. What replaced the original Peter-Brian dynamic was Peter and his friends, Joe and Quagmire, as a social group that increasingly existed just to watch Peter do things. Joe and Quagmire in the original seasons were full characters in their own right. They had their own storylines, their own personalities, their own ways of pushing back on Peter when he crossed a line. In season 6 and beyond, their role shifted. They became more of an audience for Peter than a genuine social circle. They were there to react to him, to get dragged into his schemes, to be affected by his decisions. Their own independent character work faded as the show's focus narrowed. The violence and the shock content also escalated during this period in a way that changed the show's tone significantly. Family Guy had always been willing to go to dark places. That was part of its identity. But early Family Guy used darkness strategically. It was a punctuation mark, a moment that created impact because it was surrounded by something more grounded. In season 6, the balance shifted. Darker and more graphic content stopped being punctuation and started becoming the main text. Peter began doing things that were not just stupid or careless, but genuinely brutal. The show started reaching for the most extreme version of every idea, and the most extreme version of Peter Griffin was increasingly hard to describe as a comedy character at all. What the Loathsome Characters Wiki identifies during this period is the shift from Peter being, quote, 30 to becoming something closer to a, quote, 31. Those are their words, and they are worth unpacking. Innocently insensitive means causing harm without fully understanding that you are doing it. A character who is innocently insensitive is still fundamentally sympathetic because their damage comes from a lack of awareness rather than a lack of care. You can still root for them to see what they are missing. There is still a version of this character that could do better if they just understood the situation more clearly. A psychopathic man-child is something different. That is a character who causes harm and either does not register it as harm or does not care that it is harm. The motivation for their behavior is entirely self-centered. What they want, what entertains them, what serves them in this moment. Other people's pain is either invisible to them or actively amusing. There is nothing to root for in that character because there is no version of them that is trying to do better. They are not failing to be good. They have simply stopped caring about being good at all. Season 6 is where Peter started crossing from the first category into the second. Not completely, not in every episode, but consistently enough that the direction was clear to anyone paying attention. The moments where Peter showed genuine warmth toward his family became rarer. The moments where he seemed genuinely unaware of the harm he caused gave way to moments where he seemed not to care about it. The difference between those two things is not subtle when you are watching it play out on screen. One makes you want to keep watching. The other makes you want to look away. It is worth being specific about why Season 6 in particular was the turning point rather than earlier seasons. Seasons 4 and 5 had the seeds of all of this. The beginning of Meg's targeted treatment, the IQ established in __quote _32 __, the lesson at the end structure starting to weaken. But those seasons still had enough of the original show present that you could watch them and feel like you were mostly getting what Family Guy used to be. Season 6 is where that stopped being true. The original show was no longer the dominant presence. The new version was. And the new version had a specific problem that the original version had not. The original version of Peter Griffin was designed to be a character you would spend 2 or 3 hours with, because the emotional core underneath all the comedy gave you a reason to keep watching. The new version of Peter was designed to deliver moments, reactions, lines, cutaway setups, without any particular requirement that those moments add up to something. You could dip in and out of the show and not miss anything because there was nothing being built from episode to episode. Each episode existed in isolation. Peter did something, people reacted, the credits rolled. Nothing carried forward. That is a very specific kind of damage, and it is the kind that is almost impossible to undo once it is settled in. Because the audience adjusts to the new version, they recalibrate their expectations. They stop looking for emotional continuity and start just looking for jokes. And once that happens, the show has permission to keep going in the same direction because nobody is asking it to be something more. Season 6 is when Family Guy stopped asking itself to be something more, and Peter Griffin, the character who had been the reason the show was worth caring about in the first place, was the one who paid the price for that. The next phase was not about Peter slowly drifting away from who he used to be. That phase was already finished by the time Season 6 ended. What came next was about what happens when the writers making a show stop thinking of their main character as a person and start thinking of him as a tool. And that phase had a very specific beginning. One that required the show to address something it had created, acknowledge something it had been doing, and then completely fail to do anything meaningful about it. Section 6. Seth MacFarlane steps back and the character goes off the rails. Seasons 7 to 8. There is something that happens to long-running television shows that almost nobody talks about when they happen to be enjoying one. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. There is no moment where a producer walks onto the set and says things are going to be different now. It happens quietly. In scheduling decisions and staff meetings and the slow redistribution of time and attention that comes when a successful show stops being someone's only focus and becomes one of several things they are managing at once, what happens is that the person who built the thing stops being the person most responsible for it day to day. For Family Guy, that person was Seth MacFarlane. He created the show. He voiced Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, 4 of the 6 main characters, which meant his presence was in every single scene those characters appeared in, whether he was in the writer's room or not. He had a specific vision for what the show was and what it was supposed to be doing. In the original 3 seasons, that vision was the thing holding everything together. MacFarlane knew who Peter Griffin was because he had built Peter Griffin from scratch, based on people he grew up around. Loud, opinionated, working-class New England Irish Catholics who were, as he described them, bursting with personality. But by the time seasons 7 and 8 were being made, MacFarlane's world had expanded significantly. American Dad had launched in 2005 and was running alongside Family Guy on Fox's Sunday night lineup. The Cleveland Show launched in 2009. MacFarlane was executive producing multiple animated series simultaneously while also pursuing a parallel career as a live performer, singer, and public figure. He was being nominated for awards, performing at major events, and building a profile that extended well beyond television animation. All of that is completely legitimate, and none of it is a criticism of the man. But all of it took time. And time spent elsewhere is time not spent in the Family Guy writer's room, making sure that Peter Griffin stayed Peter Griffin. TV Tropes documents this directly in its analysis of the show, noting that over the course of seasons 6 through 8, Peter develops a tendency to fight or harm others simply to get what he wants, and fully evolves into what they describe as a villain protagonist. That is not a small claim. A villain protagonist is a main character who the story is built around, but who is doing genuinely bad things, not just making mistakes, not just being stupid, but actively causing harm in ways that the show presents as the central entertainment. Breaking Bad has a villain protagonist. The show knows it, the audience knows it, and the entire structure of the storytelling is designed to make you reckon with what that character is doing. That works as a creative choice when the show is built around it intentionally. Family Guy was not built around it intentionally. Family Guy was built around a lovable, flawed father and his chaotic family. When Peter became a villain protagonist, it was not because the show made a bold, creative decision to reinvent itself. It was because the character had drifted far enough in the wrong direction, over enough seasons, that villain protagonist was simply the most accurate description of what he had become. The show was still presenting him as the lovable dad at the same time it was showing him doing things that no lovable dad would do. That contradiction sat at the center of the series, and nobody resolved it. Season 7, which aired from 2008 to 2009, is where this became undeniable. The warmth that had been fading since Season 4 was now functionally gone as a consistent presence. Episodes still had occasional moments where Peter showed something resembling genuine feeling for his family. Those moments existed, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But they were exceptions in a season where the default setting for Peter was selfishness, cruelty, or complete detachment from the consequences of his actions. The lesson at the end structure that had defined the original show was now the exception rather than the rule. Most episodes simply ended when the runtime was up, with no particular resolution to whatever damage Peter had caused along the way. The visual tone of the show also shifted during this period in a way that reflected the character changes happening underneath. Early Family Guy, for all its dark humor, had a certain lightness to its presentation. The world of Quahog felt like a real place where real people lived, and the absurd and violent things that happened were funny in part because they were contrasted against that sense of normalcy. By seasons 7 and 8, the show had moved towards something much more extreme in its imagery. Characters were shown in situations of graphic physical damage that went well beyond what the original series had been willing to do. Peter was involved in increasingly brutal physical scenarios. The chicken fight sequences, which had always been a feature of the show, escalated to lengths and levels of graphic content that felt less like comedy and more like the show simply trying to see how far it could go. Screen Rant, in its documented analysis of how Family Guy changed, notes that the show shifted to depicting the most grotesque images it could get away with during this period. Peter cutting people up, characters having their skulls exposed, eyeballs dangling. This was the new visual language of the series. The darkness stopped being a tool the show used for specific effect and became the show's default atmosphere. And once darkness is your default, it is very hard to generate the warmth and sincerity that made the original Peter funny rather than just unpleasant. Season 8 is when most serious analysts of the show place the full completion of Peter's transformation. The Loathsome Characters Wiki states clearly that while Peter was generally likable in the first 7 seasons, he suffered severe Flanderization in Season 8 and never recovered. TV Tropes places the peak of his Flanderization at Season 8's quote 34, which will be covered in detail in the next section. But the broader Season 8 context matters here because it was not just one episode that defined this period. It was a sustained, season-long presentation of a Peter Griffin who had almost nothing left in common with the character from 1999. The relationship between Peter and Lois, which had been one of the most important emotional anchors of the original show, was significantly different by Season 8. In Seasons 1 through 3, the Peter and Lois dynamic worked because you believed these two people genuinely loved each other. They argued, they frustrated each other, they occasionally said things they did not mean, but the foundation was solid. The whole structure of those early episodes, Peter screws up, Lois gets angry, they find their way back to each other, only worked because the quote 35 part was real. You believed in the relationship enough to care whether it survived each episode's chaos. By Season 8, that foundation had cracked. Peter's treatment of Lois had shifted from someone who sometimes took her for granted to someone who regularly showed contempt for her. There are episodes in this period where Peter speaks about Lois in ways that make it very difficult to believe he actually loves her. He has, across multiple episodes documented in this era, openly humiliated her, prioritized his own entertainment over her well-being, and in the Season 8 episode quote 36 repeatedly tries to shoot her. The Loathsome Characters Wiki specifically identifies quote 37 as the episode that kicked Peter's Flanderization into full gear with regard to his treatment of Lois. Attempting to shoot your wife is not a character flaw. It is not edgy humor. It is the show operating in a space so far from its original emotional territory that the original show is almost unrecognizable. The broader family dynamic during Seasons 7 and 8 reflects the same deterioration. One of the ways you can measure how far a character has fallen is by looking at how the world of the show responds to them. In the original seasons, when Peter did something harmful, the people around him responded in ways that reflected the genuine weight of what had happened. Lois got genuinely angry. Brian pushed back with real feeling. The consequences, even when they were resolved by the end of the episode, had some emotional honesty to them. By Seasons 7 and 8, the characters around Peter had largely stopped responding to him as if his actions had real weight. The show had calibrated everyone in Peter's world to accept his behavior as normal. Lois forgave things that would have been deal-breakers in earlier seasons. Joe and Quagmire absorbed abuse that earlier versions of those characters would not have tolerated. Even Brian, once the reliable voice of pushback, was increasingly occupied elsewhere with Stewie and less available to function as Peter's conscience. This is something the Geek's analysis of how Family Guy changed captures precisely. In the original version of the show, the family balanced each other. Each character had a role, and the roles fit together in a way that created tension and resolution. Peter's chaos was checked by Lois's patience and Brian's perspective. By Seasons 7 and 8, those checks were gone. The characters had become, as that analysis describes, caricatures of themselves. And without the checks in place, Peter had no boundaries. There was nothing in his immediate world that consistently reminded him, or the audience, that his behavior had real costs. The writing staff situation described in Section 2 continued to be relevant during this period. The new writers who had taken over from the original team had now been running the show for multiple seasons. They had settled into patterns. They knew what got reactions. They knew that Peter doing something extreme generated more response than Peter doing something grounded and human. The show had conditioned its own writers, through years of audience feedback and ratings data, to keep reaching for more extreme versions of the same ideas. It is a trap that long-running television shows fall into regularly, the escalation trap, where each season has to top the previous one in terms of shock and spectacle because the audience has already adjusted to everything that came before. McFarland himself acknowledged in various interviews during this period that as the series progressed, he and the writers agreed that the original Peter felt dated, and they began writing him differently. What is worth sitting with in that admission is the reasoning, that the original Peter felt dated. The original Peter was a warm, flawed, working-class father who genuinely loved his family and usually found his way back to doing right by them. If that character felt dated, the question worth asking is, dated compared to what? What was the show reaching toward instead? Because what replaced him was not a more modern or sophisticated version of the same character. What replaced him was a character with no consistent emotional interior, who could be pointed at any target the writers chose in any given week and would do whatever the premise required. That is not a more modern character. That is a less complete one. The full effect of all this on the audience's relationship with the show is something that is easier to see in retrospect than it was at the time. Season 8 still had millions of viewers, people were still watching, but something had shifted in how they were watching. The early seasons of Family Guy were appointment television. People watched because they genuinely cared about what happened to this family. The later seasons were something more like background entertainment. You could have it on and not be fully engaged and still get the jokes because the jokes no longer required you to be emotionally invested in the characters. That shift from engaged to detached is one of the most damaging things that can happen to a show's relationship with its audience. And once it happens, it is very hard to reverse. By the end of season 8, Peter Griffin was a fundamentally different character from the one who had premiered in 1999. The progression had taken 9 years and hundreds of episodes, but it was complete. The warmth was gone. The accountability was gone. The tension between who he wanted to be and what he actually did, the tension that had made him funny and human and worth watching, was gone. What remained was louder, darker, more extreme, and significantly less interesting. And the show knew it. Not necessarily the writers in the room day to day, but the show itself, through the stories it was telling and the characters it was giving speaking time to, had begun to acknowledge that something was wrong. There were cracks in the facade. Characters around Peter were starting to say things out loud that the audience had been thinking for seasons. The contradiction between the Peter the show claimed he was and the Peter who showed up on screen every week was becoming too large to ignore. __quote _38 __. The most direct acknowledgement of all, that was coming. It would arrive in season 8 itself, in a single episode that gave the whole family, and the audience, one of the clearest windows into exactly how bad things had gotten. And what made it so memorable, and so ultimately damaging, was not what happened in it. It was what did not happen afterward. Section 7. The episode that said the quiet part out loud. Quote 39. Season 8. There is a specific kind of moment in television that is worse than a show being bad. A show being bad is frustrating, but it is simple. You can turn it off. You can move on. What is harder to shake is a moment when a show looks directly at what it has become, holds it up to the light, and then decides to do nothing about it. That is not just bad television. That is a show that has stopped caring about its characters, about its audience, and about the thing it used to be. __quote _40 __ is that moment for Family Guy. The episode is the 16th episode of season 8. It first aired on April 11th, 2010 on Fox. It was written by John Wiener and directed by Joseph Lee. According to Nielsen ratings, it was watched in 6.93 million homes the night it aired. On paper, the premise sounds like a typical Family Guy setup. Something ridiculous happens in Quahog, the characters react in extreme ways, and by the end of the episode, things return to normal. That formula had driven the show for years by this point, and audiences largely knew what to expect from it. But this episode did something different. It did not just put Peter in a crazy situation and watch him react badly. It made Peter say something out loud that the show had been quietly implying for multiple seasons. Something that, once said directly in the story, rather than just demonstrated through behavior, changed the way you could look at this character going forward. Here is what happens in the episode. The local news in Quahog announces that scientists have discovered a black hole at the edge of the solar system that is expanding and will destroy the Earth within 24 hours. The news is delivered as fact, treated as real, and the entire town of Quahog goes into a full panic. Everyone believes they are about to die. People start doing things they would normally never do, because they believe there is no tomorrow left to face consequences in. Peter, faced with what he thinks is his last day alive, does not spend it with his family. He does not use the time to repair relationships or say the things he has never said or hold the people he loves. He goes out and does things for himself. He steals a lion from the zoo. He uses a specific word in a neighborhood where, as the episode frames it, that word would normally get him into serious trouble. And the episode plays his lack of consequence as something Peter finds exciting and funny. His choices and what he believes to be the final hours of his life reveal exactly what matters to him and what does not. Then, as the countdown to the end of the world reaches its final seconds, Peter turns to Lois, and he tells her something. He says that while he loves her, he hates spending time with his children. His children are right there. Meg, Chris, and Stewie hear every word. The world does not end. The news anchors immediately reveal that the black hole story was an April Fool's prank. The crisis was fake. The countdown was fake. The end of the world was fake. But what Peter said was real, and his children heard it. And the episode now has to deal with the aftermath of a father telling his kids, in what he believed were his final moments of life, when there was no reason to lie, that he hates spending time with them. Peter tries to walk it back. He tells them he was joking. He says he did not mean it. But Meg, Chris, and Stewie do not believe him, and they are right not to believe him, because the episode itself has already told us the truth. When Peter thought the world was ending and there were no more consequences to face, he did not lie to make his children feel better. He told them exactly how he felt. The joke defense does not hold up, and everyone in the room, including the audience, knows it. What follows is Peter trying to spend quality time with each of his 3 children individually in order to win back their trust. He goes to Chris first, then Stewie, then Meg. The attempts are exactly as hollow as you would expect from a man who has just admitted he finds his own kids boring. He is not trying because he has realized something meaningful about himself or about them. He is trying because he wants them to stop being angry with him. The motivation is entirely selfish. He is not making amends because he understands the harm he caused. He is making amends because the situation is uncomfortable for him. The episode ends with Peter buying his children's forgiveness. Not earning it, buying it. He gets them an Xbox 360 and a copy of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and this is treated as a resolution. The children accept this. The family moves on. Peter does not change. Peter does not grow. Peter does not develop any new understanding of who he is or what his relationship with his kids should look like. He spent money to make the problem go away, and the show allowed that to be enough. Ramsey Eisler, reviewing the episode for IGN, gave it a significantly negative assessment and noted that it did not have many redeeming qualities and that the jokes were largely weak. Emily Vanderwerf, reviewing for the AV Club, acknowledged there were funny moments but noted the episode's elaborate setup did not justify itself as a story. Watch Mojo, in multiple lists of the worst Family Guy episodes ever made, included April in Quahog as one of the clearest examples of the show at its lowest point. The specific reason given by Watch Mojo is worth quoting directly, in spirit if not in exact words. They describe this as the episode where the idea that Peter loves his family and would do anything to protect them The idea that had always existed underneath his bad behavior, as the thing that made him a protagonist rather than just a villain, gets completely tarnished. He does not love spending time with his children. He has admitted it. The show has put it on record. It is worth stepping back from the episode itself for a moment to think about what that admission actually means for the character's history. The original Peter Griffin, from seasons 1 through 3, was built on the idea that underneath all the chaos and stupidity and bad decisions, there was a father who genuinely wanted to be present for his family. That was the emotional core of the character. It was what made you root for him, even when he was being infuriating. It was what gave the show its warmth. The comedy worked because it was built on top of something real. A man who cared about the people in his life and kept accidentally making things harder for them because he was not equipped to do better. __quote _42 takes that foundation and removes it. Not by accident, not as a subtle implication, but directly, out loud, in a scene where the character himself says the words. Peter Griffin does not like being around his children. That is not a man having a bad day. That is not a man who loves his family but is overwhelmed sometimes. That is a man for whom his own children are a source of boredom and irritation rather than love and connection. The person who once said he would take a bullet for Meg has become a person who, when faced with his own mortality, uses his final moments to get away from the people he is supposed to love most. The episode is also significant because of what it reveals about the show's awareness of its own situation. By season 8, the audience had been watching Peter treat his children badly for multiple seasons. The Meg abuse had been building since season 4. The lesson at the end structure had largely disappeared. The emotional core of the family had been slowly dismantled. Viewers who had been with the show since the beginning had noticed. The criticism was not underground. It was a regular part of the conversation around the show by this point. April in Quahog feels, in several ways, like the writers acknowledging that criticism. The episode is essentially the show looking at itself and saying, yes, Peter hates spending time with his kids. We know. We have been showing you that for years. Here, we will just go ahead and say it directly. But rather than using that acknowledgement as the starting point for something meaningful, rather than having Peter genuinely reckon with what kind of father he has become and what he wants to do about it, the episode resolves the whole thing with a video game purchase and moves on. That is the specific failure of April in Quahog that makes it worse than just a bad episode. A bad episode is forgettable. This episode is memorable because it squandered something. It had the opportunity to be a genuine turning point, a moment where the show faced what it had done to this character and decided to do something about it. Instead, it confirmed that the show had fully accepted the broken version of Peter as the permanent version. The acknowledgement was there. The willingness to actually change anything was not. The Xbox ending is also worth sitting with for a moment because of what it says about the show's understanding of what a parent-child relationship is supposed to look like. Peter does not earn his children's forgiveness through honesty or genuine effort or any kind of real change in how he relates to them. He pays for it. He uses a product, a video game console and a game, to make the problem disappear. The children accept this because the show needs the episode to end and the status quo to be restored. But in terms of what it communicates about Peter as a father, the ending is devastating. This man's relationship with his own children is something he can repair by spending money. That is not a loving family. That is a transaction. The response from critics and longtime viewers to this episode was significant enough that it entered the permanent record of Family Guy discussions. Watch Mojo cited it repeatedly in lists of the show's worst moments. Fan communities pointed to it as the episode that, more than any other in this period, summed up what had gone wrong with Peter's character. The Loathsome Characters Wiki, in its detailed analysis of Peter's deterioration, identifies Season 8 as the point of his full Flanderization, and references the themes of April in Quahog as central to understanding why. There is also something worth noting about the April Fool's framing of the episode that goes beyond just the setup. April Fool's Day is built on deception, on saying something false and then revealing the truth. The show used that structure to frame the black hole as the joke, the fake thing, the thing that was not real. But in doing so, it also drew attention to what was not fake. The news was fake. The countdown was fake. Peter's confession to Lois was not fake. Peter's decision to spend his last moments running away from his family rather than toward them was not fake. The April Fool's structure accidentally highlighted the realest thing in the episode, the thing that Peter said when he thought no one would have to live with the consequences. It also aired 10 days after actual April Fool's Day, which critics noted at the time. The topical excuse for the premise did not even line up with when the episode aired, which is a minor detail but speaks to the level of care being put into the construction of the story. By the time April and Quahog ended and the credits rolled, Family Guy had done something that most shows do not survive doing to their main character. It had removed the last remaining justification for the audience to be on Peter Griffin's side. You can follow a flawed character through a story as long as you believe, somewhere underneath the flaws, that the character has something worth rooting for. You can watch a man make mistake after mistake as long as you believe he wants to do better. The moment you remove that belief, the moment the character himself tells you in his most honest moment that he does not love the people he is supposed to love, you have taken away the reason to care. The show would continue. The ratings would hold. The character would appear in hundreds more episodes. But quote, 47 marks the moment when the emotional contract between Peter Griffin and the audience was officially broken. Everything after this was the show operating without that contract in place, without the understanding that there was something real and human at the center of all the chaos that was worth protecting. Quote, 48 And what came next was not a course correction. It was not a reconsideration. What came next was the show doubling down in one of its most discussed and most criticized seasons, in a pair of episodes that arrived back-to-back at the start of Season 10, and pushed Peter Griffin so far into cruelty that even the show's own characters finally said out loud what the audience had been thinking for years. Section 8. The Hurricane, the Confrontation, and Nothing Changing. Seahorse Seashell Party, Season 10. There are episodes of television that get remembered for being great. There are episodes that get remembered for being terrible. And then there's a third category. Episodes that get remembered because they were almost something important. Almost a genuine turning point. Almost the moment when a show finally looked at itself honestly and decided to be better. Those are sometimes the hardest episodes to watch in retrospect, because you can see exactly what they could have been and exactly where they chose not to go. Seahorse Seashell Party is that kind of episode. It is the second episode of Season 10 of Family Guy. It first aired on October 2nd, 2011 on Fox. It was written by Wellesley Wild and directed by Brian Iles. It was part of a special programming event called the Night of the Hurricane, a crossover block where a hurricane affected the fictional worlds of 3 different Seth McFarland shows simultaneously: Family Guy, The Cleveland Show, and American Dad. Each show aired an episode the same night, set during the same storm, with the hurricane moving from one show's location to the next. It was a notable production event, the kind of thing that generates attention and press coverage, and the Family Guy installment was one of the most talked about episodes the show had produced in years. Not because it was funny, because of what Meg Griffin finally said. The setup of the episode is simple. A hurricane is coming to Quahog. The Griffin family is stuck inside the house together, unable to go anywhere. The television goes out. There is nothing to do. The family, with no outside distractions available, is forced to actually be in the same space and interact with each other. Brian, bored and restless, decides to eat mushrooms that cause him to hallucinate, and his storyline runs parallel to the main family drama throughout the episode. While Brian experiences increasingly disturbing visions that eventually lead to him cutting off his own ear, the rest of the family is left to entertain themselves in the living room. What happens in that living room is what the episode is remembered for. The family starts playing games and trying to pass the time. Almost immediately, they fall into their default behavior with Meg. They exclude her, they dismiss her, they use her as a target for jokes and frustration. Peter snaps at her when she opens a soda can and the sound disrupts his humming. The family plays a game that turns into an excuse to insult Meg and push her out. It is the same treatment she has received since Season 4. The targeted cruelty that Peter and the others had been directing at her for years, now compressed into the tight space of a house during a storm, with nowhere to go and no way to escape. And then Meg snaps. She has had enough. After seasons of being screamed at and excluded and shot at and left behind and told she was worthless, Meg Griffin turns on her family. She starts with Chris, calling him out for never taking her side, for going along with the abuse rather than standing up for his sister. She turns to Lois next and does not hold back. She brings up Lois's past, her failures as a mother, the ways she has neglected to protect Meg or guide her through anything, and she tells Lois directly that she does not know if she wants to be around this family when she turns 18. Lois, hearing all of this, breaks down in tears. Then Meg turns to Peter. What Meg says to Peter in this moment is one of the most direct and documented speeches in the entire run of Family Guy. She calls him out completely. She tells him he is a fat, lazy, abusive father who drinks too much and barely keeps the family above water. She tells him he has lived half his life and has nothing to show for it. She points to his children as his only real accomplishment and then tells him to look at what those children are. A disaster, she says. She calls him a total and complete embarrassment in every possible way. Peter's response to all of this is to find it funny. He laughs. He does not understand at first that he is being seriously criticized, because the idea that someone in his household would genuinely hold him accountable for anything does not register for him as a real possibility. When it finally does land that Meg is not joking, that she is genuinely tearing him apart for everything he has done, he turns to Lois for support. He asks her to make Meg stop. Lois refuses, because Peter did not stand up for her either. And then the whole family turns on each other. The criticisms that Meg aimed at each of them individually become the fuel for a broader explosion. Peter, Lois, and Chris start directing their anger at each other. The family that had spent years maintaining a false peace by using Meg as a pressure valve for all their frustration suddenly has no pressure valve. They fall apart. Peter eventually runs upstairs in tears. The confrontation ends not with resolution, but with the entire household in chaos. This is the moment that should have changed everything. Meg's speech to Peter was accurate. Every single thing she said about him was true, and the audience watching at home knew it was true, because they had watched him demonstrate all of it over multiple seasons. This was not a character being unfairly attacked. This was a character being accurately described. The show, through Meg's mouth, had finally said out loud every criticism that viewers had been making about Peter Griffin for years. The writing acknowledged the abuse. The writing acknowledged the failure. The writing acknowledged that something had gone badly wrong with the man at the center of this family. Brian, recovering from his hallucinations, tells Meg that she was right to stand up for herself. He confirms that what she did was the correct thing. He validates her experience in a way that the show had never done before. The episode, at this point, has built to something that feels like it might actually matter. For the first time in years, Family Guy had constructed a scenario where the consequences of Peter's behavior were being directly addressed, rather than silently absorbed and reset. Then the episode throws it all away. Meg, watching the chaos she has created, her mother in tears, her brother angry, Peter hiding upstairs, decides that she made a mistake. She concludes that her family cannot function without a lightning rod. Without someone to absorb all their frustration and anger and direct it away from each other, they fall apart. She decides that she is that lightning rod. She decides that her role in this family is to be the target, to take the abuse so that the rest of them can feel better about themselves and keep functioning as a unit. She goes to each of them and apologizes. She tells them she was just taking her own problems out on them. She takes back everything she said. Peter, Lois, and Chris accept this immediately. The family returns to how it was before. Everyone feels better. The episode ends. The response from critics was immediate and largely negative. TV Tropes captures the reaction with precision, describing the ending as an allegedly optimistic conclusion that actually communicates something harmful. The idea that victims of abuse should stay in their abusive households for the benefit of the people abusing them. The ending does not frame Meg's decision as a tragedy. It frames it as a kind of heroism, as if choosing to continue being treated badly is the mature and selfless thing to do. The show presents this as a touching resolution, and critics across multiple publications rejected that framing entirely. Emily Vanderwerf, reviewing for the AV Club, said there were funny moments in the episode, but noted that it spent a lot of time addressing something and then failed to do anything meaningful with it. Her grade for the episode was significantly below average. Tyron Moore of Ology gave it a 4.5 out of 10, describing it as an episode that addressed something that did not need to be addressed, meaning the show spent 22 minutes pretending to deal with the Meg problem, and then deliberately chose not to actually deal with it. TV Fanatic's Kate Moon acknowledged that Meg standing up for herself was long overdue, but described the whole thing as contrived and ultimately empty. The TV Tropes analysis also identifies something called a writer cop-out in this episode, which is worth explaining because it is precisely what happened. A writer cop-out is when a story builds to a moment that demands a real response, a genuine change, a meaningful consequence, a story development that takes the show somewhere new, and instead of following through, the writers pull back to the safety of the status quo. Seahorse Seashell Party built all the way to a moment where Meg could have left, or the family could have genuinely changed, or Peter could have had a real awakening about what he had become. Instead, Meg apologized for being right, and everyone went back to normal. This matters for understanding Peter's character specifically because of what the cop-out reveals about how the show viewed him by this point. In order for Meg's confrontation to lead to real change, Peter would have had to be a character capable of change. Real change requires self-awareness. It requires the ability to look at your own behavior, recognize it as harmful, and make a genuine decision to be different. The original Peter Griffin, from seasons 1 through 3, had some version of that capacity. He did not always use it. He did not always get things right. But the capacity was there, and the show regularly put him in situations that drew on it. The lesson at the end structure worked because Peter could learn lessons. By season 10, the show had written that capacity out of Peter almost entirely. He had become a character who did not change, could not change, and whose inability to change was now being protected by the story itself. Meg's apology at the end of quote, 53 is not just Meg backing down. It is the show protecting Peter from having to face what he is. It is the writing staff stepping in at the moment of maximum accountability and removing the accountability before it can land. The ending also permanently damaged what could have been done with Meg as a character. Fan communities and critics both identified this after the episode aired. There was a real version of this story where Meg's speech was the beginning of something, where she started being treated differently, where the show used this moment as a genuine reset for how the family related to her. That version of the story would have required work. It would have required the writers to think carefully about the Meg character and find new ways to use her that did not rely on her being a target. It would have required Peter to be different. The show chose not to do that work. Meg apologized, the family went back to treating her the same way, and seasons later, she was still in the same position. What makes Seahorse Seashell Party particularly important to the story of how Family Guy ruined Peter Griffin is not just what happened in the episode. It is what the episode's ending confirmed about the show's intentions going forward. The writers were aware of the abuse dynamic. They wrote an entire episode around it. They had Meg articulate it clearly and accurately. And then they decided to keep it anyway. Not because the story demanded it, not because it served a larger creative purpose, but because changing it would have required them to write a different version of Peter Griffin. And the different version of Peter Griffin, the version capable of growth, the version who could hear what his daughter was telling him and actually respond to it, was not the version they were making the show with anymore. That version had been gone for years by the time this episode aired. Seahorse Seashell Party was the show admitting it and then closing the door on the possibility of bringing it back. There is one more detail about this episode worth noting because it speaks to how the show understood its own situation. The episode aired as part of a major crossover event. It was given a prominent platform. The night of the hurricane was built up with press coverage and promotional material. Family Guy chose to use that platform, one of the biggest promotional moments it had in years, to air an episode that acknowledged everything wrong with its main character, and then decided to change nothing. The show had an audience and an opportunity, and it used both to confirm that it had accepted the broken version of Peter as the final version. By the time the hurricane cleared and Quahog returned to normal, the show had done something that its own writers may not have fully understood in the moment. It had eliminated the last believable reason for the audience to think things might get better. Every previous season, there had been enough of the original Peter present, enough warmth, enough occasional growth, enough moments of genuine connection, to leave open the possibility that the show might find its way back to something real. Seahorse Seashell Party closed that possibility. Meg had the conversation that needed to happen. The show heard it and walked away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What came next was not the show struggling to be better. What came next was the show fully committed to the darkest and most extreme version of Peter Griffin it had produced yet. An era where the cruelty was not accidental, not softened by warmth, and not followed by any attempt at repair. An era defined by 2 episodes in the same season that, taken together, showed what happens when a show stops thinking of its main character as a person entirely and starts treating him like a weapon it could point at anyone and anything it wanted. Section 9. The Season 10 Double Down, Lottery Fever, and the Death of Peter as a Friend. There is a version of Peter Griffin that does not get talked about enough when people discuss his decline. Most of the conversation focuses on Peter as a father, specifically on how badly he treated his children over the seasons, how the warm and clumsy dad from the early years became someone who shot at his daughter and admitted he found his own kids boring. That conversation is valid and important, and this essay has spent significant time on it. But Peter's deterioration was not limited to his relationship with his family. It spread outward. It reached into every relationship he had. And one of the clearest and most painful examples of just how far the character had fallen can be found not in how he treated Meg, not in how he spoke to Lois, but in what he did to the 2 men who were supposed to be his closest friends. Joe Swanson and Glenn Quagmire had been part of Family Guy since the beginning. They were introduced in the first season as Peter's neighbors and drinking companions, the group of friends who gathered at the Drunken Clam, watched the game together, got dragged into Peter's schemes, and kept showing up anyway, because that is what friendship looks like when it is working. In the original seasons, these friendships felt real. They had texture, they had history. Quagmire was loud and inappropriate, and often the source of the episode's most extreme humor. But he was also someone who genuinely liked Peter, and whose loyalty to the group was something the show treated as meaningful. Joe was a police officer who had been paralyzed in the line of duty, and in the early seasons he was written as one of the most capable and admirable characters in the entire show, despite his disability. His friendship with Peter, Cleveland, and Quagmire was warm and easy, and based on something genuine. By season 10, those friendships had been quietly restructured. Joe and Quagmire had stopped being full characters in their own right, and had increasingly become props in stories that were primarily about Peter. Their job was to react to him, to get pulled into his situations, to absorb what he directed at them and still be there the next episode. The warmth of the original group dynamic, the sense that these 4 people actually liked each other and chose to spend time together, had faded in the same gradual way that everything else original about the show had faded. What remained was the skeleton of a friendship without the substance that had made it feel real. Lottery Fever is the first episode of season 10. It aired on September 25th, 2011, written by Andrew Goldberg and directed by Greg Colton. It aired just 1 week before Seahorse Seashell Party, which means that the audience experienced both of these episodes in consecutive weeks. The episode that destroyed Peter as a friend, followed immediately by the episode that destroyed any hope of him being redeemed as a father. Together, they form the most concentrated demonstration of who Peter Griffin had become by this point in the show's run. The episode begins with Peter asking Lois for money to open a sushi restaurant, which gives Lois the opportunity to point out that the family's finances are not in good shape. Peter needs to stop spending money on random things that occur to him on any given day. The family needs to live on a budget. This is a reasonable position for Lois to take, and the show establishes it clearly at the start. There is a right and wrong choice in this situation, and the audience knows what it is. Peter's response is to take a second mortgage out on the family home, the house they live in, the foundation of the family's financial stability, and use the money to buy 200,000 lottery tickets. He does this without telling Lois. He does this knowing it is exactly the kind of thing she just asked him not to do. He does it anyway because the possibility of winning matters more to him than the certainty of the harm he is causing. The Griffins win the lottery. The prize is $150 million. What follows is the show's most detailed portrait of what Peter Griffin becomes when he has power over other people. And it is not pretty. The first thing Peter does is go to the drunken clam and present himself to his friends as a generous benefactor. He offers to help them. He gives Quagmire money for an investment Quagmire has been trying to get off the ground. He gives Joe money for a gift for Bonnie. This looks, briefly, like Peter using his good fortune to help the people he cares about. It looks like friendship. But the show quickly reveals that the generosity was not generosity at all. It was the setup for something much uglier. Peter begins making demands. When his friends try to leave the bar, he makes them feel guilty for not staying to spend time with him. He makes it clear, without saying it directly, that his financial help came with strings attached, that accepting his money meant accepting his right to control how they spent their time. His friends, who had taken the money in good faith, find themselves trapped. They cannot leave without feeling like they are abandoning someone who helped them. Peter has used their gratitude as a leash. Then it escalates further. Peter starts treating Joe and Quagmire as entertainment rather than as people. He pays them to perform for him. He forces them to do a song and dance number, a vaudeville routine called __quote_61__, while he watches from a position of complete power. And while they are performing, Peter shoots at them with a BB gun. He uses his two closest friends as moving targets for his own amusement. When Joe asks Peter to keep the shots away from his face, Peter shoots Joe in the eye, deliberately. Joe loses the eye and has to get a glass replacement. This is not an accident. It is not a moment of obliviousness or poor judgment. Peter is told specifically where not to aim, and he aims there anyway. When Quagmire protests, Peter shoots him in the throat. There is no ambiguity in this moment. Peter is not being stupidly careless. He is not failing to understand the consequences of what he is doing. He is doing exactly what he intends to do. He shoots Joe in the eye because he wants to, because he can, because Joe and Quagmire have no power over him in this moment, and he is enjoying that fact. The scene is documented across multiple analyses of the show. WatchMojo cited it, Qualitapedia analyzed it in detail, and it is referenced in virtually every discussion of Peter's worst moments. Qualitapedia's description is direct. Peter was at his absolute worst in this episode, treating his friends like garbage after winning the lottery. There is also the blood diamond. During the episode, Peter purchases a diamond for Lois that was obtained through violence in a war zone, harvested by rebels in a conflict that had cost lives, and gives it to her specifically to buy her forgiveness for his behavior. He is not just indifferent to the suffering that produced the object he is giving her. He is aware of it, and he does not care. He is using human suffering as currency in his marriage. The show includes this detail, plays it as a joke, and moves on. The family burns through the entire $150 million in 1 month. This is presented with some comedy, but the number, $150 million, gone in 30 days, also says something about Peter that is not funny at all. This is the money that his family's financial future was supposed to be secured by. This is the resource that could have eliminated every money problem the Griffins ever had and given his children a stable foundation for the rest of their lives. Peter spent all of it, including on things like jumping into a room full of gold coins like Scrooge McDuck, which results only in him brutally injuring himself because coins do not work the way cartoon money pits do. After losing everything, Peter has to go back to Joe and Quagmire and apologize. He tells them he will be living in a cardboard box. Quagmire, the man Peter shot in the throat, the man Peter used as a performing prop while shooting at him with a BB gun, takes the money he made from the investment Peter funded and writes Peter a check for it. He gives back to Peter the financial return on the investment Peter made so that Peter can get his house back. Quagmire gives Peter money after Peter shot him in the throat. That ending is important because of what it reveals about how the show understood friendship by this point. Quagmire writing that check is framed as a positive resolution. Friends forgive each other. Things go back to normal. The status quo is restored. But the thing the show is asking the audience to accept in that ending is genuinely strange when you look at it clearly. Quagmire has been humiliated, physically harmed, and used as a target for his supposed best friend's entertainment. His response is to be the bigger person, to give back money he earned, to restore the man who hurt him to the house he mortgaged to buy lottery tickets. There is no real reckoning. There is no moment where Peter understands that he treated two people who cared about him as props for his own amusement, and that this was wrong in a serious and lasting way. He apologizes, Quagmire gives him money, and the friendship continues as if none of it happened. The episode received a 6.7 out of 10 rating from viewers on IMDb at the time of its original airing, which is below the show's average for its early seasons and reflects the mixed reaction it generated. Multiple critics and fan communities pointed to it as a low point for the show's season 10 opening. What __62__62_ does to Peter's character is different from what the Meg episodes did, but it is equally damaging. The Meg episodes showed Peter as a bad father, someone who had stopped being the protective, loving presence his children needed and become something they needed protection from. Lottery Fever shows Peter as a bad person in a broader sense. It shows that his cruelty is not limited to the family home. It shows that given power over anyone, not just his vulnerable teenage daughter, but his adult male friends, people with their own agency and their own ability to push back, Peter will use that power to harm and humiliate. There is a specific thing that gets lost when Peter goes from a lovable friend to the version of Peter in Lottery Fever. In the original seasons, the friendship between Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland was one of the warmest elements of the show. It was the place where Peter was most relaxed, most himself, most able to just be a person without the weight of parenting or responsibility pressing down on him. The bar scenes in early Family Guy had a genuine ease to them. These four men liked each other. They gave each other a hard time, they made each other laugh, they occasionally drove each other crazy, but the underlying affection was real, and the show treated it as real. Losing that friendship as something genuine, replacing it with a dynamic where Peter uses his friends the same way he uses everyone else, removed the last remaining space in the show where Peter could be seen as a person worth knowing. When his home life showed you one thing, and his time with friends showed you something different, there was at least some version of him that felt like a real human being. When his behavior with his friends became indistinguishable from his behavior at home, that version disappeared entirely. The Geek's analysis of how Family Guy changed specifically identifies the original character dynamic as one where the family balanced each other. That analysis applies equally to the friend group. The original version of the Drunken Clam crew balanced each other. Each person had a role, each person had weight, and the interactions between them created something that felt like a real social world. By season 10, that balance was gone. The friends existed to be used by Peter, and the show had stopped pretending otherwise. It is also worth noting that Lottery Fever aired as the season 10 premiere. The first episode of a new season is a statement. It is the show presenting itself to the audience after a summer break and saying, "This is what we are, this is what you are getting, this is what we think Family Guy should be right now." The show chose to open season 10 with Peter shooting his best friend in the eye and buying a blood diamond. That was a deliberate editorial choice. The writers and producers decided that this was the right way to start a new season. That tells you something about where the show's head was at. by this point in its run. What came in the very next episode, quote 66, continued the same pattern in the family context that quote 67 had established in the friendship context. Together, these two episodes are the clearest statement Season 10 made about who Peter Griffin was. He was not a man struggling to be good. He was not a flawed person trying to do right by the people around him. He was someone who harmed the people closest to him, bought his way back into their lives when the harm became inconvenient, and then did it all over again the next time an opportunity presented itself. The question that followed from all of this, the question that fans and critics had been building toward for years by this point, was whether the show could ever come back from what it had done to this character. Whether there was any version of a repair that would feel honest rather than just convenient. Whether a character who had been taken this far in the wrong direction could ever be brought back to something resembling what he once was. __quote _68__. The answer the show would eventually attempt to provide was complicated, inconsistent, and ultimately as revealing as everything that had come before it. Because how a show tries to fix something it broke tells you just as much about the show as the breaking itself did. Section 10, quote 69 and hitting the absolute floor, Season 12. Every story has a lowest point. In a good story, the lowest point is the moment before things start getting better. It is the moment of maximum darkness that exists to make the eventual recovery feel earned. The character hits the floor, and hitting the floor is what finally forces them to look up and start climbing. That is how the lowest point is supposed to work in storytelling. Not as a destination, but as a turning point, the place the story goes before it finds its way back towards something worth caring about. Family Guy reached its lowest point with Peter Griffin in Season 12, and unlike a well-constructed story, the lowest point was not followed by a climb. It was followed by the show essentially shrugging, resetting the status quo, and moving on to the next episode as if nothing had happened, which, by Season 12, was exactly what the audience had come to expect. But that did not make it any less damaging. If anything, the casualness of it, the complete absence of any recognition that something genuinely terrible had just been presented as entertainment, is what makes this particular chapter of Peter Griffin's decline so hard to look away from. The episode is Fresh Air. It is the 14th episode of Season 12 of Family Guy. It aired on March 23rd, 2014. It currently sits at a 5.2 out of 10 rating on IMDb, which makes it one of the lowest rated episodes in the show's history. Watch Mojo ranked it the second worst Family Guy episode ever made. Phantom Strider, in a 2015 ranking of the worst Family Guy episodes, placed it 4th on the list. These are not minor assessments from obscure corners of the internet. These are the considered judgments of multiple critics and long-term viewers, and they all point in the same direction. To understand what __quote_71__ is, and why it represents the floor of what Family Guy did to Peter Griffin, you have to understand what the episode is about. Not the surface premise, which is strange enough on its own, but what the episode reveals about the character underneath the premise. The setup begins with Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's enormously wealthy father, breaking his leg. While Carter is laid up and recovering, Chris spends time with him. He keeps Carter company. He helps him pass the time. He treats his grandfather with genuine warmth and care, not because there is anything in it for Chris, but because Chris, in most of his characterization throughout the show's run, is one of the few members of the Griffin family who is naturally kind. Carter, moved by this, decides to name Chris as the sole heir to his fortune when he dies. Chris will inherit everything. When Peter finds out about this, his reaction is immediate and tells you everything you need to know about who he is at this point in the show. He has not been spending time with Chris. He has not been present as a father or interested in his son's life. The episode is explicit about this. Brian directly confronts Peter about his failure to connect with Chris, and Peter's response is to ask what is in it for him. He says this out loud. He asks his dog what he personally stands to gain from spending time with his own child. That line, delivered without shame or hesitation, is the foundation everything else in this episode is built on. Peter decides to spend time with Chris, but the motivation has nothing to do with being a father. The motivation is entirely financial. If Chris inherits Carter's fortune, and if Peter can get close to Chris and position himself favorably, then Peter can find a way to access that money. Brian points out that Peter is not doing this for Chris. Peter agrees and does not care. The pursuit of Carter's money is the only reason Peter is showing any interest in his son at all, and the episode does not try to hide this or soften it. It presents it as the straightforward truth of who Peter is. Chris, for his part, knows exactly what is happening. This is documented in the episode. Chris is aware that his father is only spending time with him because of the inheritance. He knows the attention is not real. But he goes along with it anyway, because spending time with Peter under false pretenses is still more time with his father than he normally gets. And that reality, that Chris is so starved for his father's genuine attention that he will accept a lie over nothing, is one of the saddest things the show produced in this entire era. The fact that the episode does not seem to recognize it as sad makes it worse. Then Joe and Quagmire, talking with Peter, make an offhand comment. They mention that whoever marries Chris will share his inheritance as a married couple. It is said casually, as a piece of practical information about how inheritances in marriage work legally. Peter hears it, and it gives him an idea. Peter decides to marry his son. He does not arrive at this conclusion gradually. He does not struggle with it or question it. He hears the financial logic, he processes it, and he decides that marrying his 14-year-old son is a reasonable course of action in pursuit of money. He files for divorce from Lois, actual legal divorce papers, signed and submitted, and begins pursuing Chris as a romantic partner for the purpose of accessing Carter's inheritance as a married couple. The episode plays this as comedy. There are jokes built around it. Peter makes a reservation at a romantic restaurant for himself and Chris. He engages in behavior that is framed as a father trying to win over a spouse. The fact that the spouse is his own underage child is the source of the humor the episode is reaching for. Peter is never arrested. Peter is never seriously punished. Lois mentions at one point that people have called the police, but nothing comes of it. The episode ends with Peter apologizing to Chris for only spending time with him because of money, and this apology is treated as sufficient resolution. The divorce papers that Peter filed remain a loose end. The episode does not even cleanly resolve the fact that Peter and Lois are now legally divorced, leaving that as an ongoing, unresolved detail that the show simply moves past. Peter says sorry, and the story ends. The critical response was swift and thorough. The episode's 5.2 rating on IMDb reflects a viewer rejection that was unusually strong, even by the standards of episodes that were generally considered low points. WatchMojo's ranking of it as the second worst episode in the show's history placed it in the company of the episodes most universally identified as representing Family Guy at its most broken. Qualitopedia's detailed analysis describes Peter as being at his absolute worst in, quote, 72, and notes the specific failure of the episode to hold him accountable for anything he does in it. The analysis from Qualitopedia is worth understanding in detail because it identifies something important about what made this episode different from previous low points. In earlier bad episodes, quote 73 for example, there was at least a token gesture toward consequence at the end. Peter apologized to Joe and Quagmire. Quagmire wrote him a check. The show acknowledged, in its limited way, that something had happened and that the people who were harmed by it mattered enough to receive an apology. The resolution was hollow, but it existed. In quote 74 even that hollow gesture is reduced. Peter apologizes to Chris, but the apology is specifically for the financial motivation behind his attention, not for attempting to marry him, not for filing divorce papers, not for treating his son as a means to access an inheritance. The thing Peter apologizes for is the least serious part of what he did. The most serious part, the actual attempt to legally marry his own child, receives no meaningful reckoning whatsoever. This matters because of what it tells you about where the show's moral compass was by season 12. In season 4, when Peter began targeting Meg, The show at least framed some of that behavior as something that existed within the range of dark humor. Extreme, uncomfortable, but operating within a space that adult animation had some precedent for. By season 12, the show had produced an episode where the main character attempts to marry his underage son for money, and the resolution is an apology for his financial motivation. The escalation from season 4 to season 12 had taken the character to a place where the show's own internal standards had collapsed entirely. There was no longer any line that the character's behavior was being held to, because the writing staff had stopped drawing lines. The TV Tropes recap of Fresh Air catalogs the episode's content and detail, and confirms everything the critical response identified. The episode contains multiple separate storylines and cutaway gags that involve incest references beyond the central Peter and Chris plot. Carter is shown engaging in behavior with Chris that the episode itself acknowledges is inappropriate. There is a scene involving Meg and Chris that implies a separate, ongoing incest situation between siblings, which Peter stumbles onto and reacts to with discomfort before quickly deciding to forget about it. The episode is, across its entire runtime, built around incest as a comedic premise in multiple, simultaneous directions. None of this is treated as something the show is examining or critiquing. There is no point in __quote_76__ where the content is being used to say something about the characters or the world they live in. It is simply presented as entertainment. The question of whether this is entertaining is what the IMDb rating and the critical consensus answered clearly. It is not. And it represents a failure of the show to understand the difference between dark humor that works and content that is simply dark. What __quote_77__ did to Peter Griffin specifically is complete a process that had been building since season 4. In the early seasons, Peter was a character who did harmful things without fully understanding the harm. In the middle seasons, he was a character who did harmful things and stopped caring about the harm. By __quote_78__, he was a character who did harmful things with clear awareness and direct financial calculation, and the show had stopped requiring any real consequence for any of it. The progression from oblivious to careless to calculating is the full arc of Peter Griffin's deterioration, and Fresh Air is the endpoint of that arc. It is also worth noting what this episode said about Peter as a father beyond just the obvious. The central engine of the plot is that Peter had never been giving Chris genuine attention. Chris knew it, Brian knew it, the audience watching knew it. The episode builds its entire story on the established reality that Peter Griffin is a father whose children have learned not to expect real love from him, and that this absence is so complete that Chris is willing to accept fake attention from a father who is only present because of money. That is a portrait of a broken parent-child relationship, and the show treats it as a backdrop for jokes about incest rather than as something worth addressing directly. The original Peter Griffin, from seasons 1 through 3, was a father whose children could count on him showing up eventually, however imperfectly. He was a man who would go to bat for his kids when it mattered, who got things wrong constantly, but who was genuinely trying. Chris, in Fresh Air, has so completely given up on receiving genuine fatherly attention that he accepts a lie over nothing. That is the direct result of what the show had been doing to Peter's parenting for nearly a decade. The Chris who is pathetically grateful for fake attention from his own father is the product of a version of Peter Griffin that the original show never intended to create. The episode aired in 2014, which means it came 13 years after the original seasons that had established who Peter was supposed to be. 13 years of gradual, consistent deterioration had produced a character who attempted to marry his child for money, received no meaningful punishment, apologized for the least serious aspect of his behavior, and continued as the show's protagonist in the episode that followed. The audience who had been watching since 1999, the people who had bought the DVDs, who had watched the reruns on Adult Swim, who had brought the show back from Cancellation through their loyalty and their wallets, were now watching a version of the character that bore almost no resemblance to the one they had loved. Fresh air is the floor. Not because things never got bad again after this. They did, in scattered ways across subsequent seasons. But because this is the episode where the accumulated damage of a decade of declining standards reached its most visible and most rejected point. It is the episode that most clearly shows what happens when a writing staff loses the thread of who their main character is and follows the logic of escalation all the way to the end without anyone in the room asking whether they should stop. The show had been getting warnings for years. The ratings were a warning. The critical reception was a warning.
The fan response was a warning. Seahorse Seashell Party was practically the show warning itself. None of it produced meaningful change at the character level. Fresh air is what you get when years of warnings are ignored. A main character who has been pushed so far from his original self that the show can produce something like this episode, and the only question left to ask is how it got here. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But that question has an answer. A long, documented, season-by-season answer that this essay has been building toward. And after the floor came something that, on the surface, looked like the show trying to climb back up. A series of attempts in later seasons to walk back some of what had been done to Peter, to soften the edges, to bring back traces of the original character the audience had loved. The question of whether any of those attempts worked, whether they were genuine or just cosmetic, and what they revealed about whether the original Peter Griffin could ever truly come back, is what the next section is about. Section 11, The Half-Hearted Repairs, Seasons 14 to 21, and the Inconsistency Problem. When a show breaks something, there are two honest ways to respond. The first is to fix it properly. That means identifying what went wrong, understanding why it went wrong, making real changes to the character and the storytelling, and committing to those changes even when it would be easier to fall back into old patterns. It is difficult work. It requires the writers to hold themselves to a standard and stick to it across multiple seasons, not just in one episode here or one moment there. A proper fix is consistent. It does not fix the character in November and then break them again in February. It does not apologize for the abuse in one season and then bring the abuse back 2 seasons later as if the apology never happened. A proper fix means something. The second way to respond when a show breaks something is to pretend to fix it. That means producing an episode or a moment that looks like the show is taking its problems seriously, getting credit from the audience for the appearance of change, and then continuing more or less as before once the moment has passed. It is much easier than actually fixing things. It generates goodwill without requiring real work. And for a long-running show with an established audience who wants to believe the thing they have been watching for years is capable of being what it used to be, the appearance of change can go a very long way before people realize nothing has actually shifted. Family Guy, beginning around season 14, chose the second path. It did not choose it dramatically or all at once. There was no single moment where the show declared it was turning things around and then quietly failed to follow through. It happened the same way everything else happened in this show's later years. Gradually, inconsistently, with enough genuine moments mixed in with the false ones that it was hard to be sure, from one season to the next, whether the show was actually trying to be different or just going through the motions of trying. But the overall record across seasons 14 through 21 is clear. And that record tells the story of a show that made real efforts in isolated moments, and then repeatedly walked those efforts back, producing a version of Peter Griffin that was not the broken character from the season 10 and 12 low points, but also was not the original character from seasons 1 through 3. It was something in between, a character defined by inconsistency, by the gap between what the show claimed it was doing with him and what it actually did with him, week to week, season to season. The most documented attempt at repair came in season 14, with the episode __quote_ 85 __. In this episode, Peter comes face to face with his own sister Karen, who is visiting from out of town. Karen is established as someone who bullied Peter relentlessly when they were growing up. She is cruel to him in the way that older siblings can be when they have spent decades establishing a pattern of putting someone down. And something happens in quote _86 _ that had not happened in a long time on this show. Peter experiences what it feels like to be on the receiving end of the kind of treatment he had been giving Meg for years. The episode draws a direct line between Peter's experience with Karen and his behavior toward Meg. It is not subtle about the connection. Peter, having been bullied and humiliated by his sister in ways that mirror how he has treated his own daughter, is given a moment of understanding. He stands up to Karen. He defends Meg. He acknowledges, in the terms available to a Family Guy episode, that what he has been doing to Meg is wrong. The implication of the episode is clear. Having felt what it is like to be treated the way he has treated her, Peter will stop treating Meg that way. The Loathsome Characters Wiki confirms that this episode was presented as a turning point for Peter's treatment of Meg. And in the seasons that immediately followed, specifically seasons 15, 16, 20, and 21, there was a genuine reduction in the worst of Peter's targeted abuse toward his daughter. These are documented facts. The abuse did not disappear entirely, but it became less frequent and less extreme in those specific seasons. There were episodes in this period where Peter and Meg had interactions that were not built around humiliating her. There were moments where the father-daughter relationship looked something like what it had been in the original seasons, imperfect, awkward, but not actively cruel. TV Tropes documents this period with a note that around season 14, Peter took a level of kindness and his worst treatment of the family was somewhat phased out. That is real. It happened. It would be dishonest to say the show made no effort at all during this period, because some effort was clearly made. But here's the problem. Seasons 17, 18, and 19 happened. The Loathsome Characters Wiki is direct about this. After the relative improvement of seasons 15 and 16, the abuse of Meg returned in seasons 17 through 19, making the lesson of Peter's sister a massive plot hole. Those are their words, massive plot hole. An episode that was explicitly designed to explain why Peter would stop treating Meg the way he had been treating her was simply ignored in subsequent seasons. The writers who produced those later episodes either did not remember what Peter's sister had established, did not care, or decided that having Peter abuse Meg was easier and more familiar than writing a different dynamic. This is the inconsistency problem in its most visible form. A show cannot fix a character in season 14 and then unfix them in season 17. That is not a repair. That is a temporary patch that does not hold. And a temporary patch that does not hold is in some ways worse than no patch at all, because it gives the audience the experience of thinking things have changed, and then taking that experience away from them. The pattern repeated itself with Peter's broader character across this entire period. There would be an episode where Peter showed genuine warmth toward one of his children, or made a real effort to be a decent human being, and the audience would respond positively because the original Peter was still somewhere in their memory, and they wanted to see him. And then the next episode, or the one after that, would have Peter doing something that belonged more to the season 10 version of the character than the season 14 version. The show could not commit to either the broken Peter or the repaired Peter, so it alternated between them in a way that made both versions feel less real. The Loathsome Characters Wiki notes that Peter briefly and temporarily returned to something like his original form in season 21, but that this did not hold into season 22. Season 22 produced episodes where Peter attempted to manipulate Meg into having an abortion after finding out she was pregnant. Season 22 had Peter throwing Meg out of a castle in a sequence that referenced the film Braveheart. This is Peter's behavior in the same era as the documented improvements in adjacent seasons to the ones where the abuse had supposedly been phased out. The two versions of Peter are not separated by years of story. They are right next to each other on the episode list. The inconsistency also showed up in Peter's relationship with Lois during this period. There were episodes in seasons 14 through 21 where the original Peter and Lois dynamic seemed to be partially restored, moments where the warmth between them felt real, where Peter showed genuine love for his wife in a way that the season 8 version of the character had largely stopped doing. These moments existed, and they are worth acknowledging, but they existed alongside episodes where Peter's treatment of Lois was still deeply problematic, where the contempt that had crept in during the Flanderization years was still present. The show could produce a genuinely touching moment between Peter and Lois in one episode, and then have Peter behave in ways that made that moment feel impossible in the episode that followed. What this inconsistency reveals about the show during this period is something important. It reveals that there was no unified, agreed-upon understanding in the writer's room of who Peter Griffin was supposed to be anymore. In the original seasons, every writer working on the show was working from the same character, a character with a clear identity, clear values, and clear relationships with the people around him. When different writers wrote different episodes, the Peter who showed up was recognizably the same person, because the foundation was solid and everyone was building on it. By seasons 14 through 21, that shared understanding was gone. Different writers were working from different versions of Peter. Some writers remembered or cared about the original character and wrote episodes that reached back toward him. Other writers were working from the Flanderized version that had been dominant since season 8 and produced episodes that reflected that version. With no consistent standard being enforced across the room, the Peter who showed up in any given episode depended entirely on who was writing that episode and what version of the character they were working from. The result was a character who felt different every few episodes. Not in the way that a well-rounded person is complex and multidimensional, not in the way that a character who is genuinely growing and changing might surprise you with new depth, but in a way that felt random, like the show was reaching into a bag with two different Peters in it and pulling out whichever one fit the week's premise. This randomness had a specific effect on the audience's experience of the show during this period. The original Family Guy audience, the people who had been there since 1999, had long since stopped expecting the show to be what it once was. They had adjusted their expectations downward over multiple seasons of declining standards. But even adjusted expectations require some consistency. Even a diminished version of a show can be watchable if it is reliably that diminished version. What is harder to watch is a show that keeps suggesting it might be better than it has been, and then demonstrating that it cannot sustain the suggestion. Every time the show produced an episode where Peter showed genuine care for his family, it reminded the audience of what the show used to be, and what it still could theoretically be. And every time the show followed that episode with one where Peter was back to his worst behavior, it confirmed that the memory was not going to become reality. The cycle of suggestion and disappointment, repeated across multiple seasons, was in its own way more damaging to the audience's relationship with the show than a consistent decline would have been. A show that is consistently bad can be accepted on its own terms. A show that keeps almost being good is much harder to make peace with. There is also something worth noting about the structural reasons why these repairs could not hold. The writers of Family Guy were not working in a vacuum. They were working on a show that had been running for over 15 years by the time these attempts at repair were being made. On a show where the Flanderized Peter had been the dominant version for nearly a decade. The writing patterns, the joke structures, the default behaviors that writers reached for when they needed to fill a scene or generate a quick laugh, all of those defaults had been built around the broken Peter, not the original one. Writing the original Peter required active effort and active resistance against the patterns the show had established. Writing the broken Peter was the path of least resistance. It was what the show had trained itself to do. This is why the repairs did not hold even when the intentions behind them seemed genuine. Good intentions are not enough to override a decade of deeply established patterns. The show would produce a genuine moment of improvement, and then the inertia of everything that had been built around the broken version would pull things back. Not through malice, not through a conscious decision to undo the progress, but through the simple gravitational pull of what had become normal. Normal for Family Guy by this point was a version of Peter Griffin that the show's own episodes had repeatedly acknowledged was wrong, and normal kept winning. The most honest summary of seasons 14 through 21 with regard to Peter Griffin is this: the show tried, sometimes genuinely and sometimes superficially, to walk back what it had done to its main character. Those attempts produced real moments that longtime viewers responded to warmly, because the original Peter was still a person the audience remembered and wanted to see again. But the attempts were never consistent enough, never sustained enough, and never backed by a fundamental rethinking of who the character was supposed to be that could hold across the full writing staff across multiple seasons. The repairs were real, but they did not stick. The character remained, across these years, fundamentally undefined, capable of being the original Peter in one episode and the season 10 Peter in the next, with no reliable way to know which one you were going to get. The audience that had started with 22 million viewers in 1999 had shrunk significantly by the time these later seasons were airing. By season 23, the show averaged 845,000 viewers and was down 24% in the key demographic compared to season 22. The people who had loved the original show were still out there, but many of them had stopped watching, and the ones who remained were watching a show that could occasionally remind them of why they had loved it in the first place, while never being able to fully become that thing again. __quote _89 __. The fullest picture of what was lost, the clearest accounting of the gap between the character Family Guy started with and the character it ended up with, is what the final section of this essay is about. Because the story of how Family Guy ruined Peter Griffin is not just a story about what happened to a fictional character in a cartoon. It is a story about something much larger than that, something that the numbers and the critical reception and the fan communities all point toward in their own different ways. Something that says as much about how television works and how long-running shows lose themselves as it does about one loud man in green pants living on Spooner Street in Quahog, Rhode Island. Section 12. What was lost? The legacy of the character they replaced. There is a specific feeling that comes with watching something you love get slowly taken apart. It is not like the sharp pain of something ending all at once. When a show you love gets canceled, when a character you care about gets killed off, when a story you have been following reaches a definitive ending, those moments hurt, but they are clean. There is a before and an after. You know what you had, and you know when it was gone, and the grief has a clear shape to it. You can hold it in your hands and understand what it is. What happened to Peter Griffin does not feel like that. It feels like the other thing, the slower, more confusing experience of watching something change so gradually that you cannot point to a single moment when it became something different. You keep watching because enough of the original is still present to hold you there. You keep hoping because the show occasionally reminds you of what it used to be. And then, one day, you look up, and the thing you loved has been replaced so completely that you can barely remember what it felt like when it was still itself. That is the legacy of what Family Guy did to Peter Griffin. Not a clean ending, a slow replacement. Let us start with the numbers, because numbers do not lie, and they tell a story that is worth understanding clearly. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. That first episode, Quote 90, was watched by 22 million people. 22 million. That is not just a strong opening for an animated show, that is a cultural event. That is a number that puts Family Guy in the conversation with some of the most watched television premieres in the history of the medium. People showed up in extraordinary numbers because the promise of the show, a loud, messy, funny family navigating the chaos of regular life, was something they wanted to see. By season 23, which aired in 2024, Family Guy was averaging 845,000 viewers. That number includes DVR playback through 3 a.m., meaning it captures people who did not even watch the episode when it aired live. Compared to season 22, that figure represented a drop of 24% in the key 18 to 49 age demographic, and a 13% drop in total viewership. Fox renewed the show in 2025 for 4 additional seasons, seasons 24 through 27, which will keep Family Guy on the air through at least the 2028 to 2029 television season. The show that once pulled 22 million viewers on its first night is now regularly watched by fewer than 1 million people. That decline happened over 25 years and across more than 20 seasons of television. It did not happen because the animation got worse, or because the voice cast changed, or because Fox moved it to a bad time slot. It happened, at least in significant part, because the character at the center of the show, the character whose name was in the title, the character who had brought those 22 million people to the screen on Super Bowl Sunday in 1999,
was not the same character anymore. Seth McFarland, speaking to the LA Times in 2024,
said something revealing about where the show stands now. He said that at this point, he does not see a good reason to stop. He said people still love it and it makes people happy. He described the show as having reached what he called escape velocity, a term that means something has been moving long enough and fast enough that it no longer needs the original force that got it going. It sustains itself. It keeps moving because it has been moving, not because the original engine is still running. That phrase, escape velocity, is more honest about Family Guy's current state than McFarland may have intended it to be. Escape velocity means the thing is no longer being powered by what launched it. The original Peter Griffin launched Family Guy. The warmth, the chaos, the love underneath the dysfunction, the bumbling dad who kept getting things wrong and kept showing up anyway, that was the engine. The show reached escape velocity a long time ago, which is another way of saying the show outran the thing that gave it meaning and has been coasting on inertia ever since. The critical record of what happened to Peter Griffin is extensive, and it is consistent. The Loathsome Characters Wiki states that his Flanderization completely damaged the reputation of his character, and that people who once considered him one of their favorite characters now dislike him and consider him one of the worst characters in the show's history. TV Tropes documents his progression from a kind-hearted simpleton in the early seasons to what it describes as a psychopathic man-child by season 8, and notes that his portrayal in later seasons was severe enough to earn him a place on the Villains Wiki. The Villains Wiki. The main character of a show called Family Guy is listed on the Villains Wiki. The Villains Wiki entry for Peter Griffin describes him as someone who, in later seasons, becomes an unlikable, malicious, evil, psychopathic, immature person who helps others only for personal gain, regularly engages in illegal actions, abuses his family, and is somehow always excused for his actions. It contrasts this directly with the early version of the character, who is described as a loving father and husband who cared about his family and tried to do what he thought was best for them. The contrast between those two descriptions, loving father and husband versus what the Villains Wiki documents, is the full distance that the character traveled across 20-plus seasons. That distance is enormous. It is almost impossible to believe those two descriptions are about the same character unless you have watched the journey yourself. The fan community response over the years has been equally consistent. People who grew up watching Family Guy in the late 1990s and early 2000s, people who bought those DVDs that saved the show from permanent cancellation, who watched the reruns on Adult Swim at midnight, who are the reason there was a season 4 at all, those people largely stopped recognizing the Peter Griffin on their screens as the character they had fallen in love with. This is not a fringe opinion or a small minority view. It is the dominant sentiment in every serious long-term analysis of the show, from TV Tropes to fan wikis to critical reviews published across multiple outlets over multiple years. The show also damaged something beyond just Peter as a character. It damaged the entire family dynamic that had been the show's emotional foundation. Because Peter's deterioration did not happen in isolation, it pulled everyone around him in the same direction. Lois became harder and less warm as the seasons went on, adapting to a marriage that the show had quietly shifted from a loving partnership into something much more transactional. Meg went from a relatable teenage girl into the show's designated target, a role that the show eventually acknowledged was wrong and then continued anyway. Chris and Stewie and Brian all went through their own versions of the same process, the gradual reduction of a complex character into a smaller, simpler, more extreme version of their most obvious traits. The Geek's analysis of how Family Guy changed puts it simply and accurately. At the beginning, the show was about a family of screw-ups who loved each other. By the later seasons, they borderline hate each other. And because the audience can feel that shift, the show lost the thing that had made it special. The charm of watching a family that stuck together no matter how bad things got was replaced by the experience of watching a family that treats each other as irritants and inconveniences. Those are very different emotional experiences, and audiences responded to them very differently. What makes this story more than just a complaint about a cartoon getting worse over time is what it reveals about how television works, and what happens when the people responsible for maintaining a character lose sight of who that character is supposed to be. Peter Griffin was not ruined all at once. He was ruined slowly, by a series of decisions that each seemed manageable on their own, and that added up over time to something irreversible. The IQ established in Petarded seemed like one funny episode. The escalating treatment of Meg across seasons 4 and 5 seemed like the show pushing its own edges, which it had always done.
The Flanderization of season 6 happened so gradually that you could watch it happening and still convince yourself things were mostly fine. The full abandonment of the original character in seasons 8 through 12 was alarming, but by the time it was complete, the audience had already adjusted their expectations enough times that the full picture was hard to see clearly. That is how characters get ruined on long-running shows. Not through one bad decision, but through the accumulation of many small ones, each of which moves the needle slightly in the wrong direction, until the needle has moved so far that you cannot remember where it started. The writers who made each individual decision were not necessarily trying to ruin Peter Griffin. Most of them were probably trying to do the best work they could in any given week. But without a consistent, enforced, shared understanding of who this character was supposed to be, without someone in the room whose job it was to say, "This is not Peter Griffin, we are not doing this," the small decisions added up into a massive one that nobody consciously made. The original Peter Griffin deserved better than that. Not because he was a perfect character or an especially virtuous one. He was neither of those things and was never meant to be. He deserved better because he was a genuinely interesting and genuinely human character. He was a man with real flaws and real love, and the combination of those two things made him funny and watchable and worth 22 years of loyalty from an audience that saw something of their own messy, imperfect lives reflected in his messy, imperfect one. The people who bought those DVDs in 2003 were not buying them because they wanted to watch a villain protagonist shoot his friends and attempt to marry his son. They were buying them because they wanted more time with a character who made them laugh and who somewhere underneath all the chaos made them feel like it was okay to love someone, even when that someone was regularly getting everything wrong. That character still exists, technically. You can still watch seasons 1 through 3. The episodes are still there. The original Peter Griffin did not get deleted or erased. He is preserved exactly as he was, in the episodes that built the show's original audience and made it something worth caring about. But you cannot unwatch what came after. You cannot unsee the direction the character was taken, or forget the slow, season-by-season process by which something warm and funny and human became something colder and crueler, and ultimately less interesting. The original Peter exists, but he exists in the shadow of everything the show did to him over the following 20 years, and that shadow is long. Family Guy is still on television. It will be on television through at least 2029. Peter Griffin will keep appearing in new episodes, voiced by the man who created him, doing whatever the writers of any given week decide he should do. Sometimes he will be closer to the original. Sometimes he will be further away. The inconsistency that defines seasons 14 through 21 will almost certainly continue, because the show has never resolved the fundamental question of who this character actually is anymore. And that unresolved question is the truest measure of what was lost. The original Peter Griffin did not have that problem. You knew exactly who he was. You knew what he cared about, how he would respond to things, what made him get things wrong, and what made him try to get them right. That clarity, that sense of a real and consistent person at the center of all the chaos, was the foundation the show was built on. When Family Guy lost Peter Griffin, it lost its foundation. Everything built on top of that foundation has been standing without it for a long time now. The show is still standing. But anyone who was there at the beginning, anyone who watched Death Has a Shadow in 1999, and felt the specific warmth of that original family, knows the difference between a building with a foundation and one without. The laughs are still there, sometimes. The voice is still there, always. But the person is gone. And that is the thing that cannot be bought back with an Xbox, or patched over with a single redemption episode, or fixed by renewing the show for 4 more seasons. The person that Peter Griffin used to be
is the thing Family Guy spent 25 years replacing.
And understanding that replacement, season by season, decision by decision, small choice after small choice until the original was unrecognizable, is the only honest way to understand what this show became and what it could have been if someone had remembered to protect the thing that made it matter in the first place. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.